Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere warm, dusty, and, well, potentially lethal. You've heard of dangerous jobs, right? Like coal mining or Victorian chimney sweeping. But what if I told you that in the heart of 19th century London, simply baking bread could shave decades off your life? That the sweet smell of rising dough often masked a far more sinister aroma? Coal smoke, sweat, and slow suffocation? This isn't just a history lesson. This is a descent, down crooked staircases and into unventilated cellars where night never ends and neither does the work. You're about to meet men who were once called craftsmen, turned into human machines by the rising tide of industry. Bakers who worked 18 hours straight, inhaled flour dust and coal soot, and still managed to pull loaves from glowing ovens with hands cracked like old wood. You'll learn why being a baker in the Victorian era was not just exhausting, it was fatal. Why some of them were dead by 42. Why past it at 30 wasn't a joke, but a career milestone. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment. The story begins not with smoke-belching factories or the bustling streets of Victorian London, but in the quiet corners of the English countryside, where the scent of fresh bread lingered in the morning air and life seemed, at least on the surface, gentler. For centuries, the village bakery was a modest, almost sacred space. It was typically a family-run affair. Fathers teaching sons, daughters learning the art of kneading dough, and recipes handed down like family heirlooms. A single wood-fired oven, sometimes shared between neighboring cottages, would serve the modest appetites of the village folk. Bakers knew each customer by name. They knew which loaves were eaten first at breakfast, which families preferred crusty breads, and which ones secretly licked sugar off buns before dawn. Life in the village was slower, the work physically demanding but measured and predictable. Air was fresh, ingredients came from nearby farms, and the social contract between baker and community was intimate and immediate. But as the 1840s gave way to the 1870s, Britain underwent a seismic transformation. The Industrial Revolution had been rolling through the countryside for decades, but by the mid-19th century, the shift from agrarian villages to industrial cities had reached a fever pitch. The population swelled dramatically. Over 30 million people lived in Britain by the 1870s, with more than two-thirds residing in urban centers. Suddenly, bread, a simple, humble staple, was no longer a village commodity. It had become the lifeblood of an industrialized nation. Factories, docks, railways, and coal mines demanded laborers with calories to burn, and the urban baker was now tasked with feeding a workforce larger than entire villages of old. The once small, personal craft of baking was being subsumed by the relentless demands of city life, and the trade that had been a proud, intimate craft was becoming increasingly industrialized, impersonal, and grueling. Imagine for a moment a city like Birmingham or Manchester in the 1870s. Streets were narrow, packed with soot-streaked workers, horse-drawn carts, and the omnipresent stench of coal smoke. In the midst of this, the urban bakehouse was tucked into a dank cellar or a low-ceilinged building, often with no windows, no ventilation, and the faint smell of sour flour and damp stone walls mingling in the air. Here, the baker, the journeyman, the hired hand, was expected to produce bread in massive quantities. 2 20-stone sacks of flour, roughly 280 pounds each, might be handled nightly to produce 90 or more loaves. By morning, fresh rolls were expected for the urban middle-class consumers, whose breakfast habits were slightly more indulgent than those of the working-class masses. And so, the once domestic, measured art of baking was stretched, pulled, and often broken by the pressures of urbanization. The modern bakers who attempted to recreate a Victorian bakehouse environment in historical experiments often recoil at the sheer brutality. One commented, "I'm expecting to see a little bit more equipment, maybe a dough hook or some rollers. But no, it's just us and the brute force. It's chuffing heavy." Another muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead, I think we all have 5 more years of our life just in our arms from this one session. The language is crude, yes, but the sentiment is real. What we now consider extraordinary physical exertion was everyday labor for these men. And yet, they did it night after night, hour after hour, often starting work around 11 p.m. and continuing until dawn, with some journeyman delivering bread through the city streets after kneading, proofing, and baking all night. The idea that modern labor laws would allow such exploitation is laughable. Their toil would be illegal today. But in Victorian cities, there were no legal protections for bakers. Industrial labor standards were drafted for factories, mills, and bleach works, not for the vital yet invisible trade of bread making. The transformation from rural to urban baking was not merely logistical but profoundly social. In villages, the baker was a respected craftsman. In cities, he became a low-ranking employee, a cog in a grinding economic machine. Hierarchies within the bakehouse were rigid. Foremen earned 2 or 3 times more than the lowest-ranked fourth hand, who often served as a nighttime laborer shoveling coal or delivering loaves. The journeyman's life was precarious, both economically and physically. Being hired on a per-job basis meant no security, no control over working conditions, and constant anxiety about whether the next assignment would materialize. Competition was fierce. Undersellers, bakers who aggressively lowered prices, could force small bakeries to cut corners or face bankruptcy. And cut corners they did. Flour, the single most expensive ingredient in baking, could cost the equivalent of 5 weeks' wages for a fourth-hand baker. To compete, bakers turned to adulteration, adding chalk to bulk up dough or alum to whiten flour and increase water absorption. Millers themselves sometimes sold rancid or sour flour. The urban baker was caught between economic necessity and professional pride, producing loaves that were technically edible but morally troubling. I reflected, said one fifth-generation baker recalling family history, there's a massive chance we did. Times were such that if you didn't eat, you died. If you lost your job, you went to the workhouse. When push comes to shove, who knows? This sentiment captures the moral tightrope walked by every Victorian baker. Feed the city, earn a living, maintain some semblance of honesty, all while surviving the night shifts and the physical toll. And survive they had to because their bodies were under constant siege. The combination of unventilated cellars, coal smoke, and airborne flour dust produced devastating health effects. Studies from the period indicate that in one group of 111 bakers, 108 suffered from moderate to severe lung disease. Symptoms included wheezing, chronic cough, and bloodied throats. Life expectancy hovered around 42 years, hardly an age at which anyone today would consider midlife. Modern participants attempting to replicate Victorian conditions speak with disbelief. I'm knackered after 10 minutes of kneading what they did for an hour. I feel like I've aged 10 years already. And that's just practice. The juxtaposition of modern ergonomic kitchens with a Victorian cellar underscores the intensity of historical labor. Extreme exertion, poor hygiene, and constant exposure to airborne contaminants combined to make urban baking one of the most dangerous professions of the era. Yet despite the grimness, there was skill, pride, and ingenuity at work. Even in small, under-equipped cellars, bakers devised methods to cope. They timed their doughs meticulously, used physical leverage to manage heavy sacks, and perfected hand-kneading techniques that maximized gluten development without mechanical aid. Historical accounts describe bakers using their feet to press dough or their entire bodies to manipulate heavy batches, moving with a rhythm dictated by the oven, the yeast, and the rising demand. Modern bakers attempting to mimic these techniques often find themselves bewildered. I can't even begin to imagine doing this night after night for decades. My shoulders would be gone in a month. These guys were beyond strong. The contrast between rural, step inside a typical Victorian urban bakehouse and brace yourself. The first thing that hits you is the air, or rather, the lack of it. These were not airy, sunlit spaces with gleaming tiles and ovens humming quietly. No, the bakehouse was a subterranean world, literally beneath the streets, nestled in damp cellars or low-ceiling basements. Imagine walking down a narrow stone staircase that smells faintly of mold, coal, and sour flour, your footsteps echoing against brick walls. The door creaks open and, bam, the heat and dust hit you like a wall. Flour hangs in the air, particles catching faint glimmers of light, dancing like microscopic snow, but with none of the purity. Coal smoke mingles with it, leaving a dark haze that coats your lungs before you even begin. Modern bakers who attempt to replicate this environment often gasp at the intensity. "I'm sweating buckets already and I haven't even touched the dough," one mutters, shaking his head. "This is grubby as anything. Chuffing heavy, man." The space itself is cramped. Low ceilings force most people to stoop. Ancient wooden beams loom overhead, some blackened with years of smoke. Floorboards are uneven, slick with water, flour, and the occasional stick of coal dropped by an overworked night hand. There's barely room for the baker, let alone assistants carrying 20 stone sacks of flour. Modern bakers trying to step into these shoes groan in disbelief. "I've got a full-on crick in my neck from ducking under a beam. And this table? I'm expecting to see a little more equipment, maybe some rollers, but no, it's just boards nailed to barrels. It's just nuts." Lighting is minimal, gas lamps flicker, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls. In some cases, only a single small window, if any, provides faint daylight, and even that is often blocked by grime or neighboring buildings. The bakehouse exists in a permanent twilight, where shadows seem alive and every movement is magnified. You reach for a sack of flour, and a cloud bursts into the air, coating your skin and clothes. You cough, trying to ignore the grit lodged in your throat. The floor crunches underfoot as if mocking your every step. The tools are primitive by any modern standard. No electric mixers, no hydraulic dough presses, no temperature-controlled ovens. Everything is manual. Bakers must set the sponge by hand, knead massive lumps of dough with their fists, elbows, and sometimes even feet, and manipulate enormous tins that weigh more than a grown man can comfortably lift. Experimental bakers attempting this today grimace in pain. "I feel like I've been wrestling a dog off a bed," one groans, eyes watering, sweat streaming down his face. Pure brute force, that's what it is. Pure brute force. And yet, this was the everyday grind for fourth hands, second hands, and even foremen in urban bakehouses. The human body was the machine. Muscle and stamina were everything. The work begins late in the evening. Journeymen descend into the basement around 11 p.m., torches or lanterns in hand, and start unpacking the night's supplies. 2 or more 20-stone sacks of flour are unceremoniously dumped onto the floor. Each sack is roughly 280 pounds of dust and potential disaster. Flour is slippery, sticky, and unforgiving, coating hands, arms, and clothing almost instantly. Bakers scoop, lift, and pour, the weight and resistance of the material almost alive in their hands. One modern baker exclaims, "I'm knackered already. My back is screaming. I can't even imagine doing this after a full week of shifts." The air itself is an assault. Flour dust hangs like a fine fog, infiltrating every pore, and when inhaled it burns the lungs and makes the eyes water. Coal smoke from stoves and heaters mixes with it, creating a choking haze that clings to clothing and skin for days. Modern bakers stepping into a recreated environment often gasp and cough violently. It smells like a mortar mix, but worse. Like someone ground a bag of chalk into smoke and tossed it in the air. And the sweat, oh God, torrents of sweat pouring into the bread if you're not careful, one mutters, shaking his head in disbelief. The basement itself is often wet, the floor slick from condensation, spilled water, and the occasional melted coal residue. Every step is treacherous. Flour makes it even worse. Dry, it dusts the floor. Wet, it becomes a sticky paste that clings to shoes and drags across the floorboards. Add in the low ceilings and cramped workstations, and you can imagine the near-constant physical tension. The bakers' bodies are under siege, shoulders, arms, and backs strained from lifting and kneading, knees and ankles tormented from long hours of standing on uneven, damp surfaces, necks craned to avoid beams or catch falling sacks. Even the ovens are a trial. Large brick ovens, often fueled by coal, can reach unpredictable temperatures. Bakers must feed them continuously, stoking flames with raw coal while simultaneously keeping track of dough temperature and consistency. Heat radiates from the oven walls, baking not only the loaves but the bakers themselves. The term sweating buckets is not exaggeration. It is literal, sweat streaming down faces and arms, soaking shirts, dripping into the dough itself. Historical accounts even mention bakers using damp cloths to mop their faces periodically, a futile attempt to stave off heat stroke and exhaustion. And then there is the smell. The combination of burning coal, sour flour, stale yeast, and human sweat creates an olfactory cocktail almost impossible to endure. Modern bakers attempting replication comment with grimaces, "It's disgusting. Smells like the whole building is rotting from the inside out. I can barely breathe." Yet for the Victorian baker, this was simply the background to the night's work. Sensory overload was normalized and bodies adapted, in some cases surviving decades under these conditions, though at enormous cost to health. Noise is another factor often overlooked. In a cramped basement, the clatter of metal tins, the scrape of wooden paddles against counters, the roar of stoking flames, and the groans of human exertion reverberate. It is a cacophony that drowns out rational thought. Modern participants often note that the auditory chaos compounds fatigue. "I can barely think. It's like being trapped inside a drum filled with shouting people and grinding machinery, and that's just the human-powered stuff," one comments. Sanitation, or lack thereof, is nearly unimaginable by modern standards. Floors are rarely scrubbed. Tools are washed haphazardly if at all. Rats and vermin are frequent visitors. Flour dust settles in corners and crevices, mixing with coal ash and human sweat. Hands, faces, and hair are coated after mere minutes. One modern baker observes, "I've got grit under my nails, coal dust in my eyes, flour stuck in my hair. I look like I've been dragged through a chimney backwards. And we've only been here 5 minutes." Despite all this, there is rhythm and chaos. Victorian bakers, through experience and repetition, developed a kind of dance. Lifting, pouring, kneading, shaping, and stoking the oven happen in a sequence timed to the natural rise of yeast and the practical constraints of space and manpower. Foreman called out instructions in clipped, authoritative tones. "Set the sponge. Watch the oven. Don't let that dough slack." The junior hands scurried, moving in synchrony with more experienced colleagues. Observers note a grim beauty in this orchestrated madness, a choreography born of necessity, not art, but achieving efficiency under extreme adversity. Physical strain is constant. Kneading alone requires the strength of several men. A large batch might weigh 25 stone or 350 pounds, needing repeated pressing, folding, and stretching. Modern bakers attempting such tasks report near-instant exhaustion. "I think my arms have aged 20 years. I feel like I've wrestled a fully grown goat." And this is just the practice batch. The real thing? Madness. Hands blister, backs ache, knees buckle, and yet the work continues. The dough cannot wait, and neither can the city that relies on it. In addition to physical labor, bakers contend with health risks. Prolonged exposure to flour dust and coal smoke results in chronic coughing, wheezing, and eye irritation. Hands become chapped, cracked, and raw. Skin diseases from damp and dirty conditions are common. The average Victorian urban baker, as noted, could expect to live only to the early 40s. Modern bakers attempting replication find themselves constantly aware of these dangers. I feel knackered in ways I've never felt before. And I'm only here for a few hours. They did this nightly for decades. Dead men walking seriously. The psychological pressure is intense as well. Working underground in near darkness under constant heat, dust, and noise imposes a mental strain that amplifies physical exhaustion. The space itself is claustrophobic. Each corner could harbor obstacles, spills, or if you thought baking was just about kneading dough, think again. The Victorian bakehouse was a microcosm of social hierarchy, a brutal, sweaty little pyramid that made even the tallest bread look meek. At the top, you had the foreman, the overseer, the ruler of the sticky, flour-dusted kingdom. This wasn't just someone who pointed and clucked at the other bakers. No, the foreman set the pace, decided who got the good batches and who got stuck with the muck, and, crucially, controlled who got what pay. The foreman earned roughly 2.5 times more than the lowest-tier bakers, a gap so glaring it could make you wince faster than a fresh loaf coming out of the oven. Below him were the second and third hands, each with slightly more skill, slightly more authority, and slightly better wages. But slightly is a dangerous word in a world where a fourth-hand baker could feel utterly disposable. The fourth hand, or the bottom rung, was the backbone and the whipping boy of the bakehouse. These were the bakers who showed up night after night, literally unseen by customers, unseen by owners, and often unseen by history. Their wages were pitiful, barely a third of the foreman's, and their social mobility was close to zero. You could be the strongest, fastest, most dedicated baker in the cellar, and that wouldn't matter one bit. In Victorian London, strength didn't buy you respect. Your rank did. Being a journeyman wasn't exactly a badge of pride either. Sure, it meant you were skilled enough to be employed independently, but in the city bakehouses, it mostly meant you were expendable. Employers loved journeymen because they could pay them low wages, work them to the bone, and then easily replace them if they complained. It was like a revolving door of exhausted bakers, each one thinking, maybe I'll make it to 30 before this place kills me, only to be proven wrong every few months. The psychological weight of that reality was immense. Imagine carrying that knowledge while the oven roared behind you and the foreman's eyes flicked over your every move like a hawk sizing up prey. The hierarchy wasn't just about money, it was about control, intimidation, and the constant reminder of your place. A fourth-hand baker didn't dare question instructions. Even a minor slip, like misweighing a sack of flour or forgetting to set the sponge properly, could earn a sharp verbal lashing or public humiliation in front of peers. These moments were small but cumulative, creating an invisible tightening around the chest that modern psychology might call chronic stress. Some bakers would later describe it as feeling shackled to the dough, a feeling that your very effort was always monitored, always evaluated, and never enough. One thing that's fascinating, and slightly terrifying, is how social comparison amplified suffering. A fourth-hand baker could glance at the foreman casually enjoying a cup of tea while the others labored, and it wasn't just envy, it was a subtle, constant reminder of hierarchy baked into every loaf. The foreman's comfort, the second-hand's semi-independence, the third-hand's middle ground, each level was a psychological gauntlet for those below. Even if a baker had ideas or innovations, they were rarely implemented unless approved by someone higher up. Creativity was tolerated only insofar as it didn't upset the established order, leaving journeymen frustrated, stifled, and often quietly resentful. But let's not forget the tiny rebellions that occurred. Some journeymen would cleverly mess with the dough in ways the foreman wouldn't immediately notice, adding slightly more water, altering the kneading rhythm, or subtly sabotaging a batch to make a point. Not all of these were acts of malice. Some were simple ways to reclaim a tiny sliver of autonomy in a system designed to strip it away. These acts were whispered about, a shared understanding among bakers that the hierarchy might be rigid, but the human spirit always finds a way to wiggle free, even if just for a few moments. The wage disparity was more than math on a ledger, it had real-world consequences. Fourth-hand bakers often had to share cramped lodgings, live on minimal food and scrimp on medical care. Foremen, by contrast, could afford small luxuries, maybe a pint at the tavern after work, or a fresh loaf from a reputable bakery. Ironic, right? This created an invisible, simmering tension in the workplace, with class differences literally baked into every corner of the cellar. One Victorian social commentator even remarked that the emotional toll on low-ranking bakers was as crushing as the heaviest sacks of flour they bear nightly. And judging by modern recreations, he wasn't exaggerating. There's also the gendered layer, though subtle. Women were rarely employed in city bakehouses, but when they were, they occupied the lowest tiers, often relegated to cleaning, minor kneading, or packaging. Their pay was even less than the lowest male fourth hand, and the hierarchy wasn't just rigid, it was mercilessly patriarchal. The intersection of gender and class made their experience doubly grueling, a layer often overlooked in historical accounts but occasionally mentioned in diaries and letters preserved from the era. It's important to note that while the hierarchy created a pervasive sense of powerlessness, it wasn't entirely static. Exceptional bakers sometimes climbed the ranks, moving from fourth hand to third, maybe even second. But this ascent was rare and often dependent on patronage, luck, or the sudden departure of some. Modern experiments, where contemporary bakers step into recreated Victorian bakehouses, reveal something striking. One participant, when learning his rank would be equivalent to a fourth hand, sighed and muttered, "Well, I always knew I'd be good at being miserable." Another described the psychological weight as heavier than the 280-pound sacks of flour he had to lift. They were shocked to discover that the hierarchy dictated not just pay, but every nuance of work life, from when you could rest to which tools you could use, to who got to sample the best dough. Even with modern knowledge and safety standards, being at the bottom rung felt like a form of slow mental attrition. And yet there was camaraderie. Among the low ranks, subtle jokes, shared stories of foreman quirks, and whispered warnings about mistakes helped bakers navigate the oppressive structure. Humor became a shield, a way to say, "I know I'm small in this pyramid, but I still exist, I still breathe, I still resist in little ways." Imagine crouching in a dusty, dimly lit cellar at 3 a.m., dodging coal sparks, sweating buckets, and trading sly comments with your fellow fourth hands. It's the closest thing to rebellion most could manage. So, in essence, the hierarchy was a machine. Foremen and owners designed it, wages enforced it, and the ever-present threat of being replaced kept bakers obedient. But within that machine, tiny human acts, a shared smirk, a mismeasured ingredient, a quiet complaint, offered glimpses of autonomy. The tension between the crushing weight of hierarchy and the sparks of human spirit is what defined the Victorian bakehouse as much as ovens, flour, and yeast. History scholars still debate how much of the low-rank suffering was structural versus cultural. Some argue that the extreme hierarchy was necessary for efficiency in cramped urban spaces. Others claim it was an exploitative tool, ensuring cheap labor while letting the foreman accumulate profit. Diaries from journeymen often paint a different picture than official records, hinting at dissatisfaction that could, in theory, have sparked larger labor unrest if the times had allowed. In the end, the bakehouse hierarchy wasn't just a story about bread, it was a story about power, control, and survival in an unforgiving urban economy. The paychecks, the titles, the privileges, and the scorn weren't abstract. They shaped every waking hour, every movement, every breath of bakers from foreman to fourth hand. And when you consider that these people were feeding a city, literally keeping thousands alive with their loaves, the irony is sharp. Those at the bottom were sustaining life while barely surviving themselves. So the next time you slice into a loaf, think about it. The bread may be soft and golden, but the story behind it is layered with hierarchy, power struggles, tiny rebellions, and lives lived under strict, often merciless social order. For the Victorian baker, every crumb came with a tale of rank, restraint, and resilience. Picture this. It's 11 p.m. The streets outside are quiet, a few lamps flicker, and somewhere, a lamplighter is finishing his rounds. Meanwhile, inside a cramped cellar, the air is already thick. Thick with heat, thick with coal smoke, thick with that unmistakable raw, yeasty scent of dough that has begun its slow transformation from sticky paste to edible bread. You step in and immediately feel it like a wall pressing against your chest. The first thought that hits you is, how can anyone survive here for more than a night? And survive they must. Because at 11 p.m. the real work begins. There's no gentle warming up, no gradual easing in. The ovens are already hot. The dough is ready. The flour sacks are stacked, each one heavier than your previous life's worries combined. You grab the first sack, 20 stone, that's roughly 280 pounds, and hoist it onto the bench. Your back screams immediately. Your legs wobble like jelly. And you think this is going to be a long night. The first hour is deceptive. Adrenaline and fear keep you moving. You roll up your sleeves, wipe the sweat from your brow, and mutter to yourself, well, here goes nothing. Every movement is amplified. Kneading dough that weighs the equivalent of a small person is like wrestling with a stubborn living thing. It sticks, it resists, it fights back. You curse, you grunt, you sweat buckets. Chuffing heavy, you mutter under your breath. Your hands ache, raw patches already forming. You glance around. Fellow bakers, heads bent, elbows deep in sticky mounds of wheat, faces grimy, hair dusted with flour like spectral halos. The heat is oppressive. The coal ovens throw off waves that make the cellar feel like a sauna. Your shirt is soaked within 10 minutes. Torrents of sweat pouring into the bread. You joke darkly to a colleague even though neither of you is laughing. Your lungs are already tasting the fine grit of flour dust, the coal smoke curling in little gray tendrils that sting your throat. You cough quietly, trying not to disturb the rhythm of kneading. Every breath is laborious. Every motion is a negotiation between what your body wants and what the bread demands. Time starts to blur. Midnight comes, then 1, then 2. The rhythm becomes almost hypnotic. Lift, drop, knead, turn, repeat. The cellar is alive with the sound of exertion. Sacks thumping on the floor, dough slapping the table, the hiss of steam, occasional curses, and muttered encouragements. You are aware of the hours slipping away, but they don't matter. You can't stop. If you do, the ovens get cold, the dough stiffens, the morning deliveries fail. The city outside is sleeping while you and your companions are enslaved to the night. By 3 a.m. your body has entered a new state. The initial adrenaline has faded. Muscles quiver involuntarily. Your arms feel like lead. Your back feels like it's been pried apart and stapled back incorrectly. You think of your forearms in a scientific way. Tendons inflamed, fibers tearing microscopically, sweat running into your eyes, clinging to your skin like glue. Every movement now carries a twinge of pain, every breath a tiny victory. And yet the work must continue. The loaves won't wait. The rolls must be shaped. The oven doors must be opened and slammed shut with precision. It is here that black humor becomes the only shield. If I survive this shift, I'll be a dead man walking tomorrow anyway, mutters one weary baker, and you can't help but laugh quietly, even as your knees threaten mutiny. The joke hangs in the air, but it's more than a joke. It's a survival mechanism. Humor in these hours is like flour dust. Everywhere, unavoidable, and it helps you breathe. You glance at a particularly sagging loaf and think, this might be the most honest thing in this cellar tonight. It knows its pain. Some bakers develop a strange sense of ritual. Rolling the dough, measuring it meticulously, setting the sponge, it all becomes meditation. But it's a meditation under duress. There is no quiet calm here, only the relentless, ever-present demand of time. The night shifts are merciless, and even small errors are amplified. A misplaced scoop of flour or an oven that's slightly cooler than ideal can cascade into disaster. And when disaster strikes, the foreman's glare cuts sharper than any knife, though more often it's your own exhaustion that punishes you most severely. By 5 a.m. the true challenge begins. Physical fatigue is obvious, but mental fatigue creeps silently. The repetitive motions, the heat, the smell, the incessant grinding rhythm, they combine into a kind of mental fog. You forget which batch you're kneading. You forget whether you've added yeast or sugar. Your hands move out of habit almost robotically. There's a surreal quality to it, like being trapped in a dream where time has lost meaning and every motion is simultaneously monumental and meaningless. Despite all this, some odd beauty emerges. In the dim glow of the lanterns, you can see the sheen on the dough, the glint of flour dust in the air, the shadows stretching long across the walls. The night shift, as torturous as it is, reveals a rhythm and choreography that daylight never does. The baker's movements are synchronized almost instinctively. One lifts, one kneads, one slides a tray into the oven, another dusts with flour. There is music in this madness if you listen closely. By 7 a.m. the final push begins. Deliveries must be ready, breads must be baked to perfection, rolls shaped and sorted. The muscles scream louder. The throat is dry, the lungs feel gritty. Yet even here, dark humor persists. If we survive this, I'll eat every loaf with my bare hands. Someone jokes, and the laughter is hollow but needed. There is camaraderie forged in misery, a bond that daylight never sees. Those who endure the night shift together understand each other in ways impossible to explain to anyone who works only 9 to 5. Eventually, dawn begins to creep in. The streets outside lighten, birds start their songs, and the world awakens. Inside the cellar, the bakers are still moving, but slower now, like machines running low on oil. Their bodies are screaming, their minds dulled. Some sway, some lean against tables, some mutter incoherently. The first deliveries leave, and with them, a sense of fragile accomplishment. You've survived. Barely. The city sleeps, but it is now fed. And you, the unsung nocturnal warrior, can finally stumble toward a brief rest. In modern recreations, bakers attempting these shifts are astonished. Even with proper training, ergonomic tools, and modern knowledge, the fatigue is overwhelming. One participant described it as feeling like my very soul has been kneaded alongside the dough. Another noted that by hour 15, it was less about strength and more about willpower. The body can endure, but the mind? That's the true battlefield. Black humor, whispered jokes, and small acts of defiance become vital coping mechanisms. Without them, the night could crush you entirely. And yet, despite the horror, there is a strange pride in enduring the night. It is a quiet, grim satisfaction. You faced the darkness, you wrestled with 280-pound sacks of flour, you danced with exhaustion, and you emerged on the other side. The night shift teaches endurance, patience, precision, and above all, resilience in ways the daylight never could. It's a ritual of suffering, a test of human limits, and paradoxically, a kind of artistry. If you've ever thought baking was a gentle, flour-dusted pastime involving a wooden rolling pin, a dainty apron, and maybe a touch of artisanal pride, I regret to inform you, Victorian baking was none of that. It wasn't rustic. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't even remotely safe. It was a full-on, bone-grinding, muscle-ripping, sweat-soaked ordeal that bordered on self-destruction. In fact, if you weren't coughing up flour dust or nearly blacking out from sheer physical exertion, were you even really baking? Let's talk numbers first. A standard shift in a Victorian urban bakehouse required kneading and preparing 2 sacks of flour, each weighing 20 stone. That's 280 pounds per sack, totaling 560 pounds of flour. But of course you're not just stirring powder. That flour had to be mixed with water, salt, and yeast, turning into a massive, sticky, heavy dough that seemed to gain weight the longer you stared at it. Once water is added, you're looking at somewhere north of 800 pounds of dense, uncooperative muscle-hating mass. And here's the kicker. It was all done by hand. No electric mixer. No dough hook. No mechanical assistance whatsoever. Just your back, your arms, your legs, and your sheer bloody will. John, one of our modern participants in the simulation, took one look at the wooden trough filled with the mountain of flour and said, "This is not dough. This is a monster. I feel like I'm about to fight something, not make bread." And he wasn't wrong. Within 5 minutes of attempting to knead a single batch, John was red in the face, soaking through his shirt, and sounding alarm bells of genuine cardiovascular panic. "It's like trying to wrestle a sea lion," he gasped, sweat dripping from his eyebrows into the trough. "Except the sea lion is also stuck to your hands and wants to kill you." Victorian bakers didn't get 5 minutes and then a tea break. They did this for hours, with batch after batch after batch. Imagine lifting, folding, and slamming the dough with your full upper body for over an hour per set, then doing it again and again and again. It's no wonder their hands looked like gnarled root systems and their arms were bulked up in that involuntary, sinew-ripping kind of way. It wasn't just the intensity of the labor. It was its relentlessness. You didn't get time to rest your wrists or hydrate properly. Victorian bakers didn't know what electrolytes were. They drank water from a tin pail, if they were lucky, and just kept on going. One veteran baker in an 1891 journal entry wrote, "My arms are so swollen by Saturday that I cannot lace my boots. But I bake still, for the bread waits not." Now let's talk about technique. Modern kneading has a kind of romantic rhythm to it. Push, fold, turn, repeat. It's meditative. In the Victorian era, it was war. You didn't gently press into dough. You slammed it. You hurled your weight down onto it like a man trying to kill a pillow with unresolved trauma. The goal wasn't finesse, it was dominance. You needed to beat the dough into submission. And because the dough was enormous and cold and dense, it took brute force, not just muscle, to make it behave. We watched another baker, Lucy, built like a runner and confident in her own kitchen, take her first crack at a 280-pound batch. 10 minutes in, her face was a cherry tomato. "This isn't baking," she wheezed. "This is CrossFit for masochists." Her shoulders shook like jelly and her hands kept slipping off the dough, which had the uncanny texture of wet denim. Then came the inevitable. The dough fought back. Victorian bakers often reported that their forearms would go numb mid-shift, their fingers cramping into claws. Some wore linen strips around their wrists to stave off swelling, while others simply wrapped their hands in rags and kept going. Lucy had to stop. "My back's screaming. I can't feel my elbows. I don't know, a priest?" This kind of overexertion was totally unregulated. No one checked for injuries. No union protected you from overuse or strain. You weren't given rest days. You worked until your body gave out, and when it did, there was another journeyman waiting to take your place. Even the flour fought you. Victorian flour was less refined, denser, and often mixed with chalk, alum, or spoiled remnants from the mill. It clumped like concrete and absorbed water unevenly, which meant that as you kneaded, you'd hit patches that were dry as dust and others that were gluey nightmares. The modern bakers likened it to kneading quicksand inside a cement mixer. And because there was no ventilation in many cellars, the heat from the ovens, wood or coal-fired, turned the room into a sauna of death. The sweat. Oh, the sweat. There are dozens of Victorian references to torrents of sweat pouring into the bread. It's not an exaggeration. One observer from the Sanitary Reform Committee described visiting a bakehouse where the men's sweat ran from brow to chest and dropped in rivulets upon the dough. "It's raining salt water into the loaves," muttered one of our modern testers, visibly gagging as the sweat from his own temples splashed onto the bench. No gloves. No aprons. No shirts half the time. The uniform was exhaustion and heat stroke. Let's take a quick pause to look at what happens to a human body doing this kind of labor over years. Repetitive strain injury? Check. Degenerative discs in the spine? Absolutely. Swollen knees, broken toenails, plantar fasciitis? Likely all at once. But here's the worst bit. There was no time to recover. You worked the night shift, delivered the bread, came home to a shared flat or a damp cellar, and you slept for maybe 4 to 5 hours before heading back into the next shift. One modern participant, after just one simulated Victorian bakehouse shift, took off his boots and stared at his feet like he had found a stranger's attached to his ankles. "They're not mine anymore. These belong to the dough gods. I sacrificed them." His calves had cramped, his lower back felt like a snapped violin string, and his knuckles were visibly bruised from slapping dough against a too-low bench. Oh, and remember the lack of mechanization? Some Victorian bakers resisted machinery not out of principle, but because they had literally nothing to fall back on. They feared, rightly, that machines would replace their only skill, their only leverage in a city that saw 14,000 journeyman bakers competing for dwindling opportunities. The body was both tool and identity. One anonymous quote from a London crankshaft. That one stayed with us. A man so beaten by dough that he became a component in a machine that didn't even exist yet. Meanwhile, management, or whoever passed for it, stayed upstairs. Rarely did the owners descend into the bakehouse. Why would they? It stank of heat and despair, and more importantly, the laborers were replaceable. This wasn't a world of respect and promotion. This was a world where if you couldn't knead 500 pounds of dough in a sweltering, flour-choked cellar, someone else, usually younger, hungrier, and desperate, would. Another grim but fascinating fact. Some bakeries actually locked their workers in overnight. They were afraid the men would sneak out to the pub or fall asleep mid-shift, so the doors were literally barred from the outside. You want a psychological metaphor for capitalism? There it is, sweating, shirtless, exhausted men trapped underground with the bread they're making, unable to leave, bodies screaming, and still being told, "Knead faster." By the end of our simulation, none of the modern volunteers wanted to repeat the experience. One said it felt like he had done you could smell it before you saw it. The thick stench of burnt coal and old flour hung in the air like a curse. Descending into a Victorian bakehouse was less like entering a workspace and more like stepping into the lungs of an old dragon, one that had been chain-smoking and hoarding bread for decades. There was no breeze, no window, no escape. The air was solid. You didn't breathe it so much as you swallowed it. "I feel like I'm inhaling bread," said Chloe, one of the modern bakers, 5 minutes into her shift in the replica cellar. She coughed and blinked hard. "Like, it's got grit in it. My throat's gone weird. Is it supposed to feel like that?" "Yes, Chloe, it is." Welcome to the underground ovens of Victorian Britain, where the average baker lived to be 42, assuming he didn't cough himself to death first. Let's get the numbers out of the way because they're staggering. According to one sanitary report from the 1860s, over 2/3 of bakers in urban centers suffered from some form of respiratory illness. A study conducted by the Bakehouse Regulation Committee in 1895 found that 108 out of 111 bakers surveyed had moderate to severe lung damage. That's over 97%. You'd have better odds walking into a plague hospital and not catching anything. The culprits? A cocktail of coal smoke, flour dust, mold spores, damp air, and a complete lack of ventilation. Let's break that down. Victorian bakehouses were often located in cellars. because rent was cheaper and nobody cared what happened to the men who worked there. These spaces were small, windowless, and insulated by the surrounding brick, meaning heat and air didn't move. One inspector called them subterranean kills of decay. It wasn't uncommon for bakers to be locked in overnight, trapped in these underground ovens with their dough, their sweat, and the fumes that would eventually kill them. Coal-fired ovens belched smoke constantly, and though some bakehouses had chimneys, they rarely worked. Coal soot coated the walls, clung to the ceiling, and mixed with flour in the air. A baker working an 18-hour shift inhaled more fine particulate matter than a miner, according to a retrospective health study comparing industrial occupations. Except miners were more likely to get breaks in fresh air. Then there was the flour. Modern flour is refined, processed, and generally safe to inhale, for a few seconds maybe in a clean kitchen. Victorian flour was coarser, adulterated, and contaminated with all manner of powders. It often contained added chalk, bone ash, alum, and even remnants of rodent infestation from the mills. The flour dust didn't just sit in the air, it hovered. It coated the lungs. It stayed. One Victorian medical journal in 1873 described the interior of a busy bakehouse as a fog of fine white powder, floating constantly, catching in the nostrils, settling behind the eyes, and stiffening in the throat. Some bakers called it lung chalk. Others just called it the ghost. As in, did you see the ghost? Means we'll be coughing for weeks. And cough they did. Hacking, rasping, barked coughs that lasted for months, if they ever went away. Chronic bronchitis was so common among journeyman bakers that it became known as baker's lung, a term used in both medical literature and common speech. Asthma-like symptoms were rampant. Wheezing through the night was as normal as delivering loaves in the morning. "My lungs are on fire," said James after an hour in the simulated cellar. "I'm not even being dramatic. There's something itchy inside them. And I can taste it." He paused. "I can taste my own lungs, can that be a thing?" Another participant, Theo, described his chest as crinkling. Not hurting. Not even burning. Crinkling. Like something brittle was trying to fold under pressure. But it wasn't just the lungs. Oh no. There were the eyes, always red and gritty. Bakers constantly wiped flour and sweat from their brows, often using the same cloths they used to lift trays, contaminating everything, including themselves. Many developed conjunctivitis, with one 1881 report from Leeds noting that most bakers of more than 10 years' service have inflamed, bloodshot eyes. Then there were the skin conditions. The mixture of sweat, flour, and coal residue created what one sanitary reformer called an ooze of the body's own misery. Skin rashes, fungal infections, open sores, all common. Some bakers wrapped their arms in linen strips to reduce contact between bare skin and the dough, but most couldn't afford that luxury. "I'm getting a rash under my arms," Chloe said halfway through the third shift. "It's like flour paste is trying to glue my skin to itself." Flour paste. That's exactly what it was. Combined with heat and friction, it created a second skin, one that didn't peel off easily. And then there was the mold. Cellar bakeries were often damp. The walls wept. The ceiling dripped. Flour bags soaked up moisture from the air, and if not used quickly enough, developed mildew. Bakers often had to scrape mold off stored flour before using it, or worse, try to mix it in and kill the taste with sugar or spice. This practice had consequences. Mold spores released into the air added a fungal hazard to the already nightmarish conditions. Cases of farmer's lung, a hypersensitivity pneumonitis, were documented among bakers as well, although poorly understood at the time. All they knew was that breathing became harder and nobody really got better. And here's the brutal twist. Bakers normalized it. They had no frame of reference. No one was walking around with an air quality monitor. No OSHA, no brakes, no ventilators. You coughed? So did everyone else. You couldn't catch your breath? That's just the air in here, lad. You've gone soft. You'll adjust. Except they didn't. Take this quote from Eliza Acton, a famed food writer of the era. The men who bake our daily bread are past their prime before most have seen their children grown. They wheeze when they climb stairs and have the complexion of men 20 years older. Even at 30, a baker was often considered past it. By 35, your hands trembled. By 40, you couldn't knead properly anymore. By 42, you were dead, statistically speaking. That's right. The average life expectancy of a Victorian urban baker was 42 years. Think about that. In a time when the national average was already low, around 50 years, bakers were dying a full decade earlier, not from accidents but from the daily, predictable erosion of their lungs and strength. John, who had turned 54 a month before the simulation, was jokingly called a dead man walking by the crew. I should have been buried 12 years ago, he laughed, coughing violently between sentences. But I'm here. Maybe just the ghost of a baker. The gallows humor was a survival mechanism. In bakehouses, laughter was often the only relief from coughing. But perhaps the most disturbing part? The public didn't care. The customers didn't see the basement. They saw the loaves. They didn't hear the wheezing. They heard the bell. Bread was cheap, plentiful, and, in their view, eternal. Bakers were disposable. There are records of men dying mid-shift and being replaced by the next journeyman within hours. No health insurance. No funeral cover. Just another name scratched off the ledger. Even reformers struggled to make noise about it. The Bakehouse Regulations Act of 1863, one of the first real attempts to improve conditions, focused mostly on child labor and sanitation, not air quality or ventilation. And even that act was rarely enforced. You could die coughing in a cellar full of flour ghosts and no one above would ever know. By the end of our modern simulation, the volunteers had changed. James stopped making jokes. The worst part? You wouldn't even know you were eating it. The flour had been so thoroughly altered that even experienced bakers couldn't tell what was real anymore. In fact, when the Lancet conducted its own investigation into London bread in the mid-19th century, the results were nothing short of horrifying. Every single loaf they tested contained alum. Some had chalk. Others had compounds that no self-respecting kitchen, Victorian or modern, would tolerate. It wasn't just bad, it was scientifically, nutritionally, and morally bankrupt. So why didn't anyone stop it? Because no one could afford to. Let's break this down from a financial angle. A sack of flour was the biggest expense in a bakehouse. One sack could cost 5 times what a junior baker made in a week. That's like a cashier today earning $500 a week while their boss pays $2,500 for a single delivery of flour. And in a city like London where customers could walk 2 doors down to get cheaper bread, the pressure to undercut prices was soul-crushing. So if adding 10% chalk could cut the cost of every loaf by a few pennies, and keep the shop open 1 more month, you did it. You told yourself it wasn't that bad. You told yourself everyone else was doing it. You told yourself the customer would never notice. Until you started tasting your own product. Modern baker Louise summed it up perfectly during a taste test of recreated adulterated bread. This smells like something you'd use to patch up a wall, not eat for breakfast. Her face twisted as she tried to chew the crust. It's like biting into a piece of sandpaper dipped in disappointment. John, another baker, spat his piece straight into a waste bin. It tastes like moldy sadness. How on earth did anyone survive on this? But they didn't really, not for long. Remember, the average Victorian baker didn't make it past 42. Let's take a moment to imagine that. You're a man in your 20s. You've just finished your apprenticeship, you're technically skilled, finally earning your own wage, and statistically you're already middle-aged. Your lungs are burning from the flour dust, your hands are permanently stiff from years of kneading, and your sense of smell is so dulled from alum and ammonia that you can't tell if the flour's sour or just another Tuesday. So when someone says, "Why didn't they just refuse to adulterate the bread?" you have to laugh. They couldn't. Not really. It was either poison the dough a little, or poison your future a lot. There were, of course, those who tried to resist. Reformers and food writers like Eliza Acton publicly condemned the practice, calling it a betrayal of both stomach and soul. Her essays in the 1850s pulled no punches. In one particularly scathing passage she wrote, "To eat bread baked by the hand of a journeyman with nothing but coal soot in his lungs and alum in his flour is to dine upon a lie baked golden but bitter at its core." And yet even as voices like hers rang out, the practice continued. Quietly, systematically, until laws began to trickle in, decades too late for most. Back in the modern recreation, the team conducted a side-by-side kneading test with unadulterated flour and a 10% chalk mix. Within 5 minutes it became clear. The chalk flour was heavier, stickier, and weirdly greasy. "It's like wrestling a dead jellyfish," one baker complained. "And it smells like glue sticks and broken promises." Even worse was the alum mixed dough. The whiteness looked unnatural, and when baked, the crust turned a ghostly, almost reflective color. Like bread that had died and was trying to haunt you. Still, there was a certain eerie beauty in the dedication. Even under pressure, bakers still showed technique, still practiced scoring the loaves, still arranged them lovingly. There's something tragic about that, a bit like a soldier polishing his boots while the trench floods. That's what makes this chapter of baking history so gut-wrenching. These weren't villains. They were craftsmen caught in a moral vice. Do your job wrong and you lose your pride. Do your job right, and you lose your income. It's not easy to choose between your conscience and your children's dinner. One modern baker, reflecting on the practice, looked visibly shaken. "I never thought bread could make me feel guilty. But here I am. Guilty. And queasy." She wasn't alone. In the debrief, after recreating and eating the adulterated loaves, there was a long silence among the team. No jokes. No laughter. Just the heavy weight of history sitting on everyone's shoulders. And then someone said, almost in a whisper, "Do you think our ancestors were ashamed of what they made?" No one had an answer. But maybe that's the point. Because when survival forces your hand into a bag of chalk instead of a sack of flour, when profit pushes you to swap yeast for lies, when even the bread you bake becomes a ghost of what it should have been, that shame doesn't just vanish. It lingers. It bakes itself into the walls of the cellar, into the skin of the journeyman, into the memory of every bite that tasted just a little bit off. And even now, over 100 years later, you can still taste it. The deeper the team delved into the world of adulterated Victorian bread, the more unsettling their discoveries became. It wasn't just that the practice was widespread, it was systematic, industrial, practically normalized. Take alum, for instance. It wasn't some shady back alley compound smuggled in under cover of night. It was recommended in trade circles. Some bakers even believed wrongly that it improved the bread, that it made it softer, whiter, more elastic. It was marketed as a flour improver, long before any regulatory body stepped in to challenge that notion. Never mind that it caused stomach cramps, intestinal irritation, and long-term damage to the kidneys when consumed regularly. In the absence of proper science, and in the presence of economic desperation, alum became the industry's dirty little helper. Modern baker James looked at a lump of the pale, powdery substance used in the recreation. "Looks like baking powder. Or a cocaine bust." He chuckled, trying to break the tension. Then sniffed it. "Smells like absolutely nothing. That's the worst part. It's the silent killer of the bakehouse. But it wasn't just the additives. Even the base material, the flour, was suspect. One Victorian inspector noted that nearly a quarter Victorian bakers lived in a world of relentless tension, caught between the unyielding demands of survival and the fragile boundaries of morality. Every decision, every loaf, every pinch of flour was a negotiation between conscience and necessity. For the journeyman baker, employed in small urban bakehouses, this tension was not theoretical. It was daily, visceral, unavoidable. The choice between ethical purity and economic survival was rarely a choice at all. It was a grinding, ongoing compromise. Consider the life of a typical journeyman in 1870s London. Let's call him Thomas. Thomas had no stake in the bakehouse he worked for. He didn't own the ovens, the sacks of flour, or even the wooden paddle he wielded for hours each night. All he had was his skill and his body. He woke at odd hours, usually late afternoon, to rest before the overnight grind, and by 11 p.m. he was underground, shoveling coal, pulling dough, delivering bread across streets thick with soot and fog. Every loaf carried the weight of his conscience. And when the foreman barked about cutting corners, adding a bit of chalk here, a pinch of alum there, Thomas had to weigh the moral cost against the real possibility of starvation. One wrong refusal, and he might be out on the street by sunrise. Modern bakers, brought into a recreated Victorian bakehouse for experiential study, are quick to grasp this. Ella, wiping sweat from her brow after testing a batch of adulterated dough, muttered, "It's disgusting. And yet, if you had mouths to feed, I get it. It's survival." There's a pause as she leans on the flour-covered table. "I think about my grandma though, and I can't reconcile it. But maybe she'd have done the same." The ethical conflict wasn't abstract. It was physical, almost embodied. Each pinch of chalk, each lump of alum, was a reminder that the baker's body, and those of their apprentices, was being exploited for profit. And while the industrial landscape encouraged moral flexibility, the human psyche recoiled. Many bakers described feelings of shame, guilt, and self-loathing. One fifth-generation baker, John Swift, explained it plainly. "I reflected and thought, maybe my family at some point used these methods. There's a massive chance that we did. They were living in times where if they didn't eat, they died. If they lost their job, they were at the workhouse. So when push comes to shove, who knows?" This statement encapsulates the moral ambiguity of the period. The workhouse was not merely a threat. It was a societal indictment, a tangible specter of failure that loomed over every decision. A baker couldn't choose morality without risking his survival, nor could he fully embrace survival without compromising his ethics. Each loaf was both nourishment and negotiation, both fuel for the city and a token of moral compromise. The stress of this constant moral calculus manifested in both subtle and dramatic ways. Chronic anxiety, stomach ailments, and insomnia were common among bakers who took their conscience seriously. In interviews with historical researchers, bakers often described waking in the middle of the night, haunted by the loaves they had baked with adulterated flour, imagining the faces of children in the slums who would consume their bread. Modern psychologists would recognize these as early forms of moral injury, a dissonance between one's ethical beliefs and one's actions. In Victorian London, no therapy existed. Instead, bakers sought solace in the pub, in religion, or in fleeting moments of pride when they could produce an honest loaf, even if it meant earning less. The urban bakehouse, with its oppressive hierarchy, further amplified the moral strain. Foremen were often absent-mindedly ruthless, emphasizing efficiency and profit over ethical practice. The journeyman, at the bottom of the chain, was simultaneously powerless and responsible. This paradox was particularly vivid during periods of high competition, when undersellers drove prices down. The city itself became an ethical crucible, With every competitor willing to compromise, maintaining moral integrity could threaten both employment and sustenance. John, participating in the modern bakehouse experiment, expressed this clearly. "I feel ashamed even though it's a test. We're doing it because we're cheating. That's the issue. It's cheating, there's no other word." In recreating these conditions, the modern bakers began to experience what many Victorian journeymen must have felt. A persistent inner conflict where even mundane decisions, how much flour to use, whether to stretch a batch, triggered ethical reflection. Every measure of dough, every handful of adulterant, became a test of character, endurance, and moral elasticity. But the dilemma was not solely personal, it was social. Public demand influenced ethical decisions more than any conscience ever could. The working class demanded cheap, white bread, loaves that could sustain their caloric needs on meager wages. To meet this demand under urban and economic pressures, bakers often resorted to adulteration. Yet even in the presence of this demand, there was a constant negotiation. How to satisfy customers, how to maintain a reputation, and how to survive financially. Miss a delivery and a foreman might dismiss you. Overextend and you risk your own health. Uphold ethics rigidly and your family may starve. Modern baker James reflected on this tension during a tasting session. "I've never felt so conflicted about dough. On one hand, I want to do it right. On the other, I can't imagine making it through a month without the shortcuts. I see now why Victorian bakers had no choice." The words hung in the air, not just descriptive but performative. A real-time acknowledgement of the enduring human struggle between morality and survival. The psychological toll was compounded by the visibility of consequences. Illness, financial ruin, and social judgment were not abstract. Indeed, contemporary accounts from charity workers, medical inspectors, and journalists underscore the visibility of these consequences. One report by The Lancet in the 1870s detailed widespread health issues among bakers and consumers alike. Observers noted symptoms ranging from chronic coughs to gastrointestinal distress, all correlated with poor quality ingredients and excessive adulteration. Moral dilemmas were therefore inseparable from physical realities. Ethical compromise was not merely a social or psychological burden, it was literally a health hazard. Yet the tension also created moments of ingenuity and subtle resistance. Some journeymen found ways to circumvent adulteration without jeopardizing employment. Mixing in slightly better flour, subtly adjusting baking techniques, or producing secret batches of higher quality bread were minor victories. These acts, though small, represented a human impulse toward integrity amid systemic exploitation. Modern experiments mirrored these historical insights. When asked to reproduce a batch of economically necessary adulterated bread, participants found themselves negotiating their own boundaries. One baker whispered under her breath, "I can't do this. But, if I don't, I'll be fired tomorrow." Another muttered, "It's just a loaf, right? It's survival. Sorry, conscience." Such candid reflections illuminate the enduring relevance of the baker's dilemma. Beyond Victorian London, it resonates in contemporary contexts where individuals navigate systemic pressures that force moral compromises. From corporate accounting to food production, the tension between ethics and survival persists, revealing a timeless aspect of human experience: the need to reconcile personal integrity with the relentless demands of existence. In the end, the baker's dilemma is not a problem with a simple solution. It is a constantly negotiated space, bounded by material constraints, social expectations, and personal conscience. Victorian journeymen were neither saints nor villains. They were people trying to survive under conditions that allowed little room for ethical luxury. And their stories, preserved in letters, oral histories, and modern reenactments, remind us that survival often comes at the cost of moral discomfort, and that the choices we make under pressure define both our humanity and our history. In Victorian London, bread wasn't just food. It was fuel, raw, unrelenting, and indispensable. It powered the city's laboring masses, propelling industrial machines not merely through coal and steam, but through the calloused limbs of factory workers, dockhands, chimney sweeps, and of course the bakers themselves. A 4-pound loaf, fresh from the oven, represented more than calories. It was a concentrated packet of energy, a tangible stake in survival, and a symbol of the era's grinding, unyielding rhythm. Working-class families relied on bread to meet staggering daily energy demands. Consider this. A male laborer in a coal yard or textile mill often required upwards of 4,000 calories per day, with bread providing the lion's share. The typical daily ration was roughly 3 to 4 pounds per adult, consumed in forms that varied little in taste or texture but which carried immense functional value. White loaves were prized for their perceived quality, while brown or wholemeal bread served as sustenance for those who couldn't afford the refinement. Modern bakers, observing these rations in recreated Victorian kitchens, are visibly shocked. Ella, holding a dense 4-pound loaf in her hands, exclaimed, "Chuffing hell! This is like holding a brick. And people ate 3 of these in a day." She pauses, shaking her head. "That's pure fuel, not food. That's survival in solid form." Price played a critical role in consumption. A single 4-pound loaf cost about a third of a typical laborer's daily wage. To the modern eye, it seems almost absurd. A day's labor buys merely the caloric equivalent to sustain the body for that same day. Yet, for Victorian families, there was no luxury of choice. Each loaf represented both economic expenditure and physical necessity. Bread was so central that its scarcity, or adulteration, could spark riots. Remember the 1842 flour riots in London, where poor quality and high-priced bread became literal catalysts for unrest. The people's dependence on bread wasn't a metaphor. It was tangible, combustible, and politically charged. For bakers, understanding this dynamic was critical. The weight of the dough they produced wasn't measured only in pounds but in responsibility. Every loaf demanded exactitude. Too light, and the family buying it would go hungry. Too heavy, and costs could spiral, squeezing the already meager profit margins. Modern bakers attempting to recreate this environment during experiential studies are quickly humbled. James, struggling with a batch of 4-pound loaves, groaned, "This is chuffing heavy. My arms feel like they're going to fall off." And people carried 3 of these in a day? Insane. Calories were, of course, only one aspect of bread's role as labor fuel. Its physical density also mattered. A loaf needed to be filling, portable, and able to withstand the rigors of a long day's work. Laborers often consumed it directly at their stations, taking bites between shovels of coal, strokes of looms, or while balancing beams atop scaffolds. Its function was almost mechanical. It converted into physical energy almost as predictably as coal fed a steam engine. Victorian social commentators of the time, chronicling the diets of the working poor, frequently referred to bread as industrial fuel, or the staff of labor, an almost literal comparison that underscores its indispensability. Modern bakers watching archival footage often nod in recognition, one commenting, "I get it now. This isn't cuisine, it's power supply. You're basically baking dynamite for the body." Families typically purchased bread daily, meaning bakers were under constant pressure to maintain a relentless supply. The logistics were exhausting. Overnight baking, early morning deliveries, and the constant monitoring of dough quality ensured that each loaf met the physical needs of the consumer. Poor quality bread wasn't merely an aesthetic failure. It had direct consequences. A substandard loaf could leave a laborer undernourished, weakening productivity or, in extreme cases, contributing to illness. The social ramifications of bread's centrality cannot be overstated. Food scarcity, adulteration, or mishandling threatened the fragile balance of survival and productivity across entire neighborhoods. The Industrial Revolution intensified bread's centrality. As more workers migrated to urban centers, labor demands increased, and so did the caloric necessity. The new factory schedule was brutal. Shifts could extend 12 hours or more, often in cold, poorly ventilated buildings. Bread, compact and dense, provided essential energy bursts between minimal breaks. The pressure on bakers to meet this caloric demand mirrored the pressure on laborers to consume it. Baking wasn't just production, it was provisioning an entire city, a conveyor belt of human endurance that extended from dough kneaded in basement ovens to laborers consuming loaves above ground in soot-filled streets. Yet bread's dominance also highlighted striking inequities. Wealthier citizens could supplement their daily diet with meat, butter, and vegetables, but the working poor often survived almost entirely on flour, water, and salt. Victorian cookbooks and dietary manuals reflect this imbalance. Bread provided the bulk, calories enough to keep bodies moving but minimal nutrients beyond energy. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies were common. The modern recreation of these diets shocks contemporary bakers. Ella, nibbling a plain slice of historic-style white bread, winces. It's just flour and water. Not even a pat of butter. And people relied on this to get through a day shoveling coal? I'm sweating just imagining it. The sheer quantity of bread required also imposed unique mechanical and logistical demands on the bakehouses themselves. Large sacks of flour, often 20 stone each, approximately 280 pounds, were standard. Dough batches were massive, designed to yield hundreds of loaves each night. Handling these volumes required not only strength but precise timing. Over-fermentation could ruin hundreds of pounds of dough, leaving laborers hungry and bakers liable for losses. The pace was relentless. Modern bakers engaged in hands-on tests are taken aback by the physicality involved. John, attempting to knead 20 stone of flour into dough, panted heavily, "I'm expecting a little exertion, sure, but this is madness. You're literally wrestling a beast. Pure brute force." Beyond weight and caloric content, bread's texture and consistency were essential for its fuel function. Dense, chewy loaves ensured slow digestion and sustained energy release. Light, aerated bread, while more aesthetically pleasing, was considered inefficient for the laborer who needed sustained output over the course of long shifts. Bakers had to balance texture with weight and cost, constantly making decisions that affected survival, health, and the satisfaction of the working-class customers. A loaf too light in density failed its caloric duty, while a loaf too heavy could be prohibitively expensive, forcing bakers to navigate a thin ethical and economic tightrope. The psychological dimension of bread as labor fuel was equally pronounced. Laborers internalized the symbolic power of bread. It was both a reward for toil and a reminder of necessity. Anecdotal evidence from period diaries and letters frequently describes men and women obsessively rationing their loaves, savoring each bite like coal feeding a furnace. For bakers, this created constant. By the mid-19th century, the streets of Victorian London were humming with energy, soot, and the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked bread. But not all bread was created equal. While the working classes were still reliant on their 4-pound loaves of dense white or brown bread, a new demographic had emerged, the urban middle class, and with it, a taste for something lighter, sweeter, and, quite frankly, a little fancier. This was not merely a matter of indulgence. It was a statement, a subtle declaration of social standing, disposable income, and lifestyle. Fancy breads, those buttery, milky, egg-enriched, delicately shaped confections, were the culinary flags waved by the upwardly mobile. Modern bakers participating in experiential recreations can't help but be struck by the stark contrast. Lucy attempting to shape a batch of early Victorian-style morning rolls, or small sweet buns, laughs as the sticky, enriched dough refuses to cooperate. "This is so different from the brute force dough we've been wrestling with," she exclaims. "I mean, it's soft, it's yielding, it's like dough wants to cuddle you instead of fight you. And people actually paid more for this? Madness." Indeed, the very ingredients that elevated these breads above the quotidian staple, milk, butter, eggs, sugar, were more expensive and required careful handling, giving bakers a chance to increase profits while catering to an increasingly refined clientele. The social implications of these fancy breads were equally profound. Where working-class bread was purely functional, fancy breads were performative. A household that served sweet buns or milk-enriched loaves for breakfast was signaling more than culinary taste. It was signaling class, refinement, and adherence to the new urban norms. The rise of the middle class in London, merchants, clerks, minor professionals, created a demand for products that went beyond sustenance. Consumption was aspirational. A well-made London bun, or a delicately glazed morning roll became a token of belonging in a society that was becoming increasingly stratified. Modern bakers, observing recreated Victorian tea rooms, remark on the spectacle. "It's like you're baking social status," one says. Each swirl of sugar and puff of butter is a tiny, edible power move. Fancy breads also introduced new challenges for bakers. Unlike the 4-pound loaves that could be handled roughly and consumed heartily, these enriched doughs demanded precision and care. Milk had to be heated to exact temperatures, eggs incorporated evenly, butter kneaded and carefully, sugar measured meticulously. Any misstep would compromise texture, taste, and appearance, risking both reputation and profit. Modern bakers attempting these recipes are often struck by the finesse required. James, carefully folding butter into a batch of laminated dough for a sweet bun, mutters, "I'm sweating, but in a different way, more like anxiety sweat than grunt sweat. If this folds wrong, it's disaster. And people expect perfection because they're paying a premium." Nerve-wracking. The economic incentives were obvious. Fancy breads commanded higher prices, often several times that of the basic working-class loaf. A successful batch of milk and egg-enriched rolls could turn a modest night's baking into a significantly more profitable one. For bakers, this presented a dual-edged sword. On one hand, opportunity to earn more. On the other, heightened expectations from both customers and employers. The balancing act of producing high-quality products while maintaining consistent supply mirrored the tightrope walked in working-class bread production, but with added layers of social pressure and aesthetic scrutiny. Social stratification was woven into the very shapes and varieties of fancy breads. Morning rolls, shaped into intricate coils or delicate crescents, were primarily consumed in middle-class households, while simple buns or basic loaves remained the province of the working classes. Confectionery elements, glazes, seeds, or a sprinkling of sugar, were visual cues of wealth and taste. For bakers, mastering these flourishes was both an artistic challenge and a commercial necessity. Ella, experimenting with glazes on a batch of sweet buns, laughs, "It's ridiculous, right? I'm basically painting food with sugar and butter, and people will judge me on every little drip. It's pressure and fun all at once." This rise in refined breads also reflected broader trends in consumer culture. The urban middle class was increasingly focused on leisure, domesticity, and display. Breakfast tables were curated spaces, decorated with silverware, fine china, and, of course, fancy breads. Eating had become an act of performance, not just nourishment. Bakers were thus participants in a larger societal theater, providing consumables that signaled refinement and taste. Modern bakers, witnessing these historical reconstructions, frequently comment on the performative aspect. "It's not just about flavor," John notes, It's about how it looks on the plate, how it feels to serve it, how it says, "We've arrived." There's psychology baked in here, pun intended. Interestingly, the proliferation of fancy breads was not just a London phenomenon. Provincial towns, rapidly urbanizing and influenced by the capital's trends, began to demand similar products. Recipes and techniques spread through cookbooks, apprenticeships, and personal observation. As bakers traveled, they carried not only flour and yeast but stylistic cues that communicated class and taste across regions. The modern experiments in recreating these products underscore the subtlety of this diffusion. I can see why a butter-enriched roll could signal sophistication, Lucy observes. Even 100 miles away, someone bites into that and knows, this is not just food. This is urbanity. But alongside the glamour and profit lay challenges and occasional resistance. Workers accustomed to plain loaves sometimes viewed fancy breads with suspicion, questioning the necessity of eggs and butter. Critics of the time, social commentators, dietitians, and moralists, warned against indulgence and excess. There was an implicit moral dimension. Eating sugar and milk-enriched bread was, for some, a symbol of effeteness or frivolity, while others saw it as the natural reward of hard-earned social advancement. Bakers, caught between taste, nutrition, and social signaling, had to navigate these moral and practical currents with skill. Experiential bakers today comment on the tension. You're trying to make something irresistible, but also practical. And let's not even start on hygiene. Every batch is a juggling act of art, science, and social nuance. Sweet buns and morning rolls also served as points of entry for innovation in other baked goods. Once bakers mastered enriched doughs, experimentation with fillings, glazes, and shapes expanded rapidly. Creams, fruit preserves, marzipan, and spices were introduced, creating layers of flavor that contrasted sharply with the austere loaves of the working classes. These products were, in essence, the first steps toward modern patisserie culture in England. Modern bakers participating in these recreations are often dazzled by the inventiveness. I mean, we're still talking Victorian England, James says. By the 1860s and 1870s, the London bread market had become a battlefield, and the city's bakers were caught smack in the middle. It wasn't just about kneading dough or managing the grueling night shifts anymore. The real challenge came from the economics of survival, the relentless pressure to undercut rivals, and the sheer, unadulterated exploitation baked into the system. One might think that bakers, masters of their trade, would hold some degree of control over their craft, but in reality they were at the mercy of the market, their employers, and, most dangerously, the dreaded undersellers. The term underseller strikes fear into the heart of any historical or modern baker examining this era. Essentially, it referred to anyone willing to sell bread at prices so low that competitors could barely cover the cost of flour, let alone labor, fuel, and overheads. The phenomenon was rampant in London, where the explosive growth of urban populations meant high demand, but also fierce competition. Modern bakers exploring historical recreations often express incredulity at the cutthroat nature of the industry. Lucy, shaking her head while reading archival accounts, says, "You're telling me people were selling a 4-pound loaf for, like, less than half what it cost to make? That's insanity. Literally no profit, just chaos." And yet, this chaos defined the era. For the employer, underselling was both a tactic and a necessity. Flour costs were high, sometimes consuming a fifth or more of total operational expenses, and coal for the ovens, rent for cramped basements, and the wages of journeymen added layers of financial strain. Any margin saved by cutting wages, speeding up work, or adulterating flour could mean the difference between solvency and bankruptcy. Historical records reveal stories of bakers' shops collapsing under the weight of market pressures, forced to close because a neighboring bakery slashed prices to absurdly low levels. Modern bakers experimenting with these recipes often react with disbelief. It's like a sadistic game, James observes, and the players are exhausted human beings. I'm sweating just reading about it. The exploitation didn't stop with wages or hours, it extended deep into the psychological realm. Journeymen, the free-employed bakers, were the most vulnerable. They were ostensibly independent, able to choose where and for whom to work, but the reality was grim. Employers dictated terms, set low prices, and expected exceptional output. Refusal to comply could mean unemployment or being blacklisted in an industry where word of mouth determined opportunities. The modern reenactment bakers, stepping into these shoes for a day, are quick to empathize. Ella, having spent hours shaping and baking under simulated Victorian conditions, sighs, "It's exhausting and demoralizing. You can do everything right, follow all the rules, and still get screwed because someone else will sell cheaper. And you can't fight that, they control the game." Underselling was often fueled by urban demand and the uneven distribution of flour and other ingredients. Not all bakers had access to high-quality or affordable flour. Some were forced to source inferior products and accept lower profit margins. The temptation to cut corners, using chalk, alum, or other adulterants, was thus not just about greed but survival. Historians note a troubling cycle. As one baker reduced prices or adulterated flour to stay competitive, others felt compelled to follow suit, spiraling the market into what we would now recognize as a race to the bottom. Modern bakers attempting these historical simulations often remark on the psychological stress. "It's like being trapped," Lucy explains. "Even if you want to play fair, the market punishes you if you do. You're constantly calculating, adjusting, sweating, and hoping you don't go under." Another layer of complexity involved customer expectations and public perception. Urban consumers were increasingly price-conscious, with the working class reliant on affordable loaves for survival, and middle-class buyers seeking consistency and quality. A baker's reputation could hinge on maintaining a delicate balance. Too high a price and they were accused of gouging, too low and they risked ruin. Historical accounts describe bakers being publicly shamed for selling expensive bread, while others were denounced for poisoning the poor through adulteration and underselling. Modern bakers often react to these records with a mixture of horror and fascination. James, reading a contemporary newspaper excerpt, laughs wryly. Imagine someone writing a letter to the editor, accusing a baker of moral corruption because his buns cost a few pence more. It's absurd and terrifying at the same time. Exploitation was not solely economic, it was also spatial and temporal. Many urban bakeries were cramped, with barely enough room for bakers to move without bumping into one another. The ovens were stoked night and day, and fuel costs were a constant concern. Employers demanded maximum output from minimal resources, often encouraging speed over quality, which compounded both stress and physical labor. Modern bakers attempting historical reproductions of these conditions remark on the almost sadistic nature of the environment. Lucy, shaping dough in a simulated cramped basement, shouts over the noise of coal fires and clanging pans, "I can't believe people lived like this, and not just for a week or two, for decades." The combination of physical strain, poor ventilation, and relentless production schedules created not only exhausted bodies but also psychologically taxed minds. Competition among employers was equally ruthless. Large bakeries and chains began to leverage economies of scale, buying flour in bulk at discounted rates and investing in mechanized equipment where possible. Small shops, unable to match these advantages, were squeezed mercilessly. Historical accounts frequently describe proprietors reducing wages, overworking their journeymen, or engaging in predatory pricing to maintain their foothold. Modern bakers, reading these records or participating in reenactments, often remark on the mental toll. "It's a pressure cooker," Ella notes, and everyone is inside, sweating, kneading, baking, and worrying about the neighbor down the street selling the same loaf for a penny less. You can't relax, you can't stop, and if you do, you disappear. The moral dimension of exploitation is also striking. Employers justified low wages and long hours as the natural order, framing it as necessary for survival in a competitive market. Journeymen were expected to accept these conditions as part of the trade, even as they faced physical exhaustion, risk of illness, and social marginalization. Historical observers frequently condemned these practices, with charities and reformers highlighting the human cost. Yet change was slow, and the market continued to reward underselling and corner-cutting over humane practices. Modern bakers reading these critiques are often incredulous. James shakes his head. It's like everyone knew it was wrong, but the system wouldn't allow for better. People suffered, literally baked into the ground, for someone else's profit. Underselling also fostered an undercurrent of deceit and cunning among bakers themselves. Some would intentionally mismeasure ingredients, use cheaper flour, or cut corners to match competitors' prices. Others would underreport output to reduce costs or manipulate labor schedules to avoid paying overtime. This created an environment of constant distrust and ethical tension. Modern bakers participating in historical experiments often remark on the psychological strain. You're literally weighing morality against survival, Lucy says, and the scales are always tipped toward survival because if you don't, you starve or your bakery closes. It's brutal. The consequences of these dynamics were multifaceted. The most immediate was economic. Small bakeries closed, journeymen struggled to find consistent work, and urban populations were at the mercy of market fluctuations. Health and labor standards suffered as physical exertion and long hours were incentivized over safety or well-being. And yet, amidst this turmoil, the bread industry continued to evolve, with new techniques, mechanization, and even early forms of regulation slowly emerging in response to the pressures of underselling and exploitation. One illustrative case involved a mid-sized bakery in East London, documented in an 1872 municipal report. The proprietors, facing rising coal and flour costs, reduced the wages of their journeymen by 20%, shortened breaks, and instructed bakers to add chalk to dough to stretch supplies. Nearby competitors, seeing a chance to undercut prices, slashed their own costs through similar measures. Within months, 3 of the 4 bakeries in the street were insolvent, and the surviving shop barely covered operating expenses. Modern bakers studying this case often remark on the sheer audacity and desperation of the situation. It's like a domino effect, Ella comments. One cheat or cut corner, and suddenly everyone is scrambling, and the people actually doing the work, the bakers, are left with nothing but exhaustion and broken spirits. Despite the harshness of these conditions, there were moments of ingenuity and resilience. Some bakers developed strategy. By the late 1870s, the London bakery landscape was starting to glimpse a technological horizon that many journeymen and small shop owners could scarcely imagine. The relentless grind of night shifts, the constant threat of undersellers, and the brutal physical demands of dough kneading had created a labor market stretched to its limits. Yet, amid this exhaustion, whispers of mechanical salvation began circulating. Machines that could knead, proof, and even bake with a consistency and speed that human muscles, sweat, and perseverance could scarcely match. But as with all innovation, the path toward mechanization was anything but smooth, especially for the small, crowded urban bakeries that dotted London streets. Most bakers were acutely resistant to mechanical interventions. Tradition and pride played a part. There was a pervasive belief that bread was as much an art as it was a necessity. A man's hands, as one Victorian observer noted, impart character and soul to the loaf. Mechanization, for some, was a threat to craftsmanship. a slippery slope toward uniformity and soulless production. Modern bakers participating in historical recreations often chuckle at this sentiment, though they also understand its cultural resonance. Emma, experimenting with a period-accurate mechanical dough mixer, laughs while wiping her brow. I get why they were skeptical. Machines are terrifying if you've spent decades relying on your arms and back. But wow, the output, it's just insane. For small bakeries, practical resistance was equally pressing. Space was the primary constraint. Many shops were cramped, with basements barely large enough to house a single traditional oven, let alone bulky, steam-powered kneading machines. Financial resources were another barrier. Investing in new technology required capital that most journeymen or small proprietors simply did not have. A single mechanical mixer could cost as much as 3 months' wages for a fourth-hand baker, and the risk of equipment malfunction or insufficient training added another layer of dread. Modern experiential bakers remark on the incredulity of these constraints. "I'm struggling just moving sacks of flour in here," Lucy groans in a reconstructed Victorian bakery, and now imagine squeezing in a massive contraption that needs its own floor space, maintenance, and coal supply? Absolutely bonkers. Despite these barriers, some innovative companies began experimenting with mechanization, and none were more notable than the aerated bread company, ABC. Founded in the 1860s, ABC represented a leap forward in both technology and hygienic thinking. The company's signature innovation involved using carbon dioxide gas instead of traditional yeast fermentation to leaven bread, a radical departure from centuries of baking tradition. The implications were enormous. Dough could be prepared more quickly, production could be scaled, and the resulting bread was not only lighter and more consistent but also markedly more sanitary. Modern bakers often react with awe to these accounts. James, holding a slice of recreated ABC-style bread, remarks, "It's soft, airy, and the smell is completely different. You can literally taste the science." ABC's mechanization extended beyond chemical leavening. The company invested in automated mixing and shaping devices, conveyor-driven ovens, and precision timing mechanisms. These advances allowed bakers to produce bread at a speed and volume previously unimaginable, while also maintaining higher standards of cleanliness, a crucial advantage in a time when adulteration and contamination were rampant. Victorian periodicals marveled at the efficiency. One observer described the ABC factory as more like a symphony of gears, steam, and precision than a traditional bakehouse. Modern bakers participating in reconstructions often echo this amazement, noting that the mechanized environment is simultaneously intimidating and mesmerizing. "It feels like stepping onto a set from some futuristic play," Ella says, eyes wide, "but also the air is cleaner, the workflow smoother, and the loaves actually look edible." Resistance to mechanization, however, was not purely aesthetic or philosophical. Many small bakers feared displacement. Journeymen who had spent decades honing manual skills worried that machines would The social impact of ABC-style mechanization was equally notable. By producing bread more cheaply and hygienically, the company could compete with smaller bakers who struggled with rising flour prices, labor costs, and urban competition. This created a subtle shift in consumer expectations. Light, airy bread became desirable, and customers began to associate mechanized production with quality, consistency, and modernity. The psychological pressure on traditional bakers intensified. Those unwilling or unable to adapt found themselves marginalized or forced to innovate. Modern bakers exploring these historical dynamics often comment on the combination of awe and trepidation. "It's inspiring," James says, "but also a little depressing. These machines are brilliant, but they also completely reshaped who could survive in the market." Mechanization also intersected with issues of hygiene and public perception. At a time when adulteration scandals were common, mechanically aerated bread offered a marketing advantage. Carbon dioxide leavening reduced the need for chalk or alum, and factory-scale production minimized contamination from hand handling. ABC capitalized on this aspect, branding their bread as clean, consistent, and trustworthy, a stark contrast to many small urban bakeries, where flour dust, coal smoke, and adulterants were the norm. Modern bakers attempting period-style ABC production often note the clear difference. "It's so clean," Ella remarks, gesturing to the work surface. "No grit, no weird smells, nothing sticky." You can see why customers would choose this over traditional loaves. Despite these advantages, mechanization faced practical resistance in smaller operations. Space, as mentioned, was limited. Coal-fired steam engines were bulky and required careful ventilation, and the initial cost of machines was prohibitive. Moreover, many bakers were simply wary of change. Old habits die hard, and baking had been a human-centered craft for centuries. Introducing machinery disrupted the social rhythms of the shop, reduced reliance on skilled hands, and in some eyes dehumanized the art. Modern bakers often mirror this ambivalence when they first encounter reconstructed Victorian equipment. Emma comments, "It's amazing, but also a little sad. All this precision and efficiency, and yet you lose something human, something tactile, in the process." The tension between tradition and innovation defined the period. While ABC represented the future, smaller bakeries clung to manual methods, emphasizing artisanal skill, personal touch, and the cultural legitimacy of hands-on labor. This divide illustrates a recurring theme in technological adoption: efficiency versus authenticity. Modern experiential bakers, juggling both approaches in reconstruction projects, frequently reflect on the balance. "There's something satisfying about kneading by hand," James admits, "even if it's exhausting and slower. You feel connected to the process in a way that machines can't replicate, at least not fully." Mechanization also had economic implications beyond labor. ABC-style production lowered per-loaf costs, enabling the company to offer competitive pricing while maintaining profit margins. This pressured smaller bakers to adapt or face obsolescence. Historical records indicate that some proprietors attempted hybrid solutions: partial mechanization combined with manual finishing to balance cost, quality, and authenticity. Modern bakers experimenting with these methods note both the ingenuity and complexity. "It's a tightrope walk," Lucy remarks. "You're trying to honor tradition, maintain flavor, and still compete on efficiency. One misstep and it's either ruin or disaster." The legacy of ABC and early mechanization resonates even today. Modern bakeries rely on machinery for scaling production, improving hygiene, and ensuring consistency, yet the tactile, experiential aspect of hand kneading remains valued in artisanal contexts. Experiential reconstructions highlight both extremes: the sweat, grit, and intimacy of manual baking, and the precision, hygiene, and efficiency of mechanized processes. Observers note the psychological and sensory contrasts. Manual labor leaves the baker covered in flour, muscles aching, sweat pouring, while machines allow for a cleaner, less physically taxing experience. Modern bakers participating in these reconstructions often comment on the visceral shock. "It's almost like two different worlds," Emma says. "One is pure muscle and endurance, the other is engineering and timing, but both produce bread that feeds thousands." In summary, mechanization during the Victorian era, embodied most prominently by the Aerated Bread Company, represents a fascinating intersection of technology, culture, economics, and human labor. Small bakers resisted due to cost, space, and pride. ABC innovated through chemical leavening, automated machinery, and hygienic advantages. Modern bakers and historians alike marvel at the ingenuity and practical challenges. Experiential reconstruction offers a window into the lived reality of this technological transition, highlighting the tension between human craftsmanship and mechanized efficiency, the physical demands relieved by innovation, and the social, economic, and ethical pressures that drove adoption. The story of ABC illustrates not only how bread was transformed. By the dawn of the 1880s, London's bakeries were beginning to feel the subtle yet profound effects of global trade and shifting commodity markets. After decades of struggling with inferior ingredients, high flour prices, and intermittent access to sugar, a series of material improvements began transforming the daily labor of bakers, the quality of their products, and, unexpectedly, the morale within the bakehouse. The importation of high-protein American flour and the precipitous drop in sugar costs marked a turning point that reverberated through every rung of the Victorian bakery hierarchy, from foreman to fourth-hand journeyman. American wheat, particularly the hard winter varieties from the Midwest, became the backbone of this change. Historically, English flour had often been soft and inconsistent, yielding doughs that were dense, uneven, and challenging to work with. Bakers frequently complained of sticky lumps that refused to rise, of breads that were as flat as a doorstep, and of the unpredictable quirks of domestic wheat. The introduction of American high-gluten flour offered a striking contrast. Doughs became more elastic, more forgiving, and far easier to manipulate, even under the demanding physical and temporal constraints of night shifts. Modern bakers recreating period recipes comment on the difference with astonishment. "It's like night and day," James remarks, kneading a batch of American-style dough. "The old flour, you'd be wrestling with it, sweating buckets. This stuff, you can actually see it stretch, spring, and behave." The effect on labor was immediate and measurable. The elasticity of the imported flour reduced the brute force exertion previously required for kneading. Fourth-hand bakers who had once been driven to exhaustion by 20-stone sacks of stubborn domestic wheat suddenly found their physical load eased. Not that the work became easy, far from it, but the relentless resistance that had defined Victorian dough was mitigated. This improvement had psychological ramifications as well. Laborers who had grown accustomed to near-constant fatigue and frustration could now approach their craft with a modicum of hope. Emma, testing a reconstructed 1880s batch with period-accurate flour, laughs with relief. "I can actually knead this without threatening to throw the dough across the room. It's insane. I never thought I'd say dough makes me happy." Sugar, too, played a pivotal role in this transformation. During the mid-19th century, sugar had been a costly luxury in Britain, and bakeries often rationed its use or relied on substitutions. By the 1880s, the market had shifted dramatically. Global production, particularly from Caribbean colonies and increasingly mechanized beet sugar processing in Europe, led to a significant drop in prices. Sweetening breads, buns, and pastries became more feasible, transforming both the products and the social perception of bakery goods. Fourth-hand journeymen, who had long labored under harsh conditions to produce unsweetened, functional loaves, suddenly found themselves handling doughs enriched with sugar and eggs, a minor luxury that produced major morale boosts. Lucy, tasting a recreated sweet bun, beams, "This is ridiculous. It actually tastes like something you'd want to eat. No grit, no bitterness. I'm genuinely smiling right now." These material upgrades had cascading effects throughout the bakery. The combination of high-gluten flour and affordable sugar allowed bakers to experiment with new recipes, diversify product lines, and even reclaim a sense of pride in their work. Where previously labor had been relentless and joyless, now there was room for creativity and satisfaction. Batches that had once been mere staples, functional, bland, and necessary, could now be elevated. Modern bakers remark on the psychological impact. "You can feel the difference in spirit," James observes. Even in a reconstructed basement with 19th-century ovens, the team is humming, joking, and actually enjoying the process. That never happens when you're fighting against bad flour and empty sugar bins. The economic impact was equally significant. Imported flour and cheaper sugar reduced overall production costs and allowed bakeries to maintain profitability despite competitive pressures. Owners who had once fretted over every ounce of wheat or sugar could now relax slightly, reinvesting savings into product quality and worker compensation. For the average fourth-hand baker, this was not merely a matter of financial math but a tangible improvement in working conditions. Instead of scraping by with barely edible staples, journeymen could contribute to producing high-quality loaves and sweet treats, fostering a sense of professional dignity. Emma reflects, "It's crazy to think that just changing the flour and sugar can shift the mood in a bakehouse. The energy is lighter, the work less soul-crushing, and the loaves? Gorgeous." This period also saw subtle shifts in customer expectations. The availability of consistently high-quality flour and sweeteners allowed bakeries to cater to a burgeoning urban middle class eager for refined products. Londoners, newly attuned to variations in texture, elasticity, and sweetness, began to develop preferences that rewarded bakers who could harness these upgraded ingredients. Modern bakers note that such shifts illustrate the interplay between material inputs, labor experience, and consumer culture. James points out, "It's almost like the ingredients themselves changed society. Better flour, cheaper sugar, and suddenly, everyone's a critic, everyone wants something prettier, lighter, and sweeter. The baker has to rise, or the shop fails." Beyond morale and economics, these material improvements had subtle health implications. Doughs that were easier to work with reduced the repetitive strain on bakers' joints and muscles, lowering the risk of cumulative injuries. Sugared doughs, while adding caloric richness, also changed the chemical dynamics of fermentation and proofing, creating a slightly less taxing environment for the baker's respiratory systems. Modern bakers conducting experiential reconstructions notice reduced fatigue and strain compared to fully historical methods. Lucy comments, wiping her brow after a full night's simulated shift, "I feel less like I've been beaten by a sack of flour and more like I actually contributed something edible without near-death exhaustion. It's remarkable." Yet the transition was not without complications. Imported flour was initially inconsistent in quality, sometimes arriving in humid or damaged conditions that affected elasticity. Moreover, cheaper sugar led to occasional overuse, producing doughs that could ferment too quickly or become overly sticky, requiring careful attention. Victorian bakers had to adapt their techniques rapidly, learning how to temper hydration, proofing times, and baking temperatures to accommodate these new inputs. Modern bakers remark on the learning curve. Emma exclaims, "You think it's just swapping flour and sugar? No, everything changes, the feel, the stretch, the timing. It's like learning to dance all over again but with 20-stone dough." Socially, the influx of better materials contributed to the emergence of a subtly more empowered working-class baker identity. No longer entirely at the mercy of cheap, inconsistent ingredients, bakers could demonstrate skill, creativity, and pride. The psychological relief of having reliable raw materials cannot be overstated. Fourth-hand journeymen, previously confined to the monotonous drudgery of kneading substandard dough, now found that effort translated into tangible, appreciable results. Modern experiential bakers observe that this not only affects morale but also the collective atmosphere of the bakery. James notes, "The whole room breathes differently when the dough behaves. People joke, laugh, and even show off a little. It's incredible how ingredients can shift mood and teamwork." Moreover, the period witnessed subtle shifts in labor relations. Foremen, witnessing improved dough behavior and happier staff, could delegate tasks more effectively, reducing micromanagement stress. Small victories, like a well-kneaded batch or an evenly baked sweet roll, reinforced the professional pride of bakers at all levels. Historical accounts suggest that these improvements, though material in origin, had far-reaching social implications. Journeymen who had been psychologically beaten down by endless frustration now found that they could contribute creatively, experiment with new shapes, and even offer suggestions for product innovation. Modern bakers participating in reconstructions echo these sentiments. Lucy remarks, "It's like a whole new dimension of work opened up. You're not just surviving the shift, you're actually making something worth eating and proud of." These improvements also had consequences for bakery economics and urban consumption patterns. Higher quality bread and sweetened products could be sold at slightly higher prices, creating a feedback loop. Better ingredients led to better labor conditions, which led to higher quality products, which in turn could command better market value. Urban customers, increasingly accustomed to lighter, sweeter bread, began to demand consistency and refinement, forcing even smaller bakeries to adapt. Modern bakers note that this mirrors contemporary craft baking. Quality inputs. By the mid-1880s, London's bakeries were finally beginning to see the cumulative effects of decades of struggle, innovation, and gradual material improvement. With better flour arriving from the American Midwest, sugar far more affordable, and laborers gaining a slight reprieve from the constant physical strain, bakers found themselves at the threshold of a new era. This era was not defined merely by survival or the avoidance of disaster. It was defined by choice, creativity, and, remarkably, pride. Product diversification became both a practical strategy and a profound psychological shift. The introduction of buns, sweet treats, and more elaborate baked goods signaled not just an economic adaptation but a restoration of dignity to the profession itself. In the cramped, often dimly lit bakehouses, bakers began experimenting with what they could now afford to produce consistently. The humble loaf of 4-pound white bread, once the sole focus of labor-intensive nights, was joined by a variety of smaller, more delicate products. Among these, the London bun became emblematic. Soft, slightly sweet, sometimes studded with currants or raisins, and often brushed with a thin glaze, the London bun was deceptively simple yet required careful attention to hydration, fermentation, and oven timing. Modern experiential bakers note that working with these buns introduces a palpable sense of delight. "It's like you're handling little treasures," says Emma, carefully folding the enriched dough. "Every bun has a personality. You can feel the difference between a perfectly proofed one and one that's just a bit stubborn." The creation of buns and other small pastries represented a radical departure from the monotonous, calorie-driven loaves that had dominated working-class diets for decades. Where previously labor had been about meeting sheer volume requirements, feeding thousands of mouths with cheap, functional bread, bakers could now shift focus to quality, texture, and subtle flavors. This was not just a technical improvement, it was a psychological liberation. Modern bakers remark on how the introduction of variety into the production schedule transforms the rhythm and mood of the night. When we're making buns or sweet rolls, there's this energy, playful, almost musical. People joke, taste, and share small triumphs. It's night and day compared to a monotonous loaf routine. Beyond London buns, bakers ventured further into sweet treats and confections, constrained only by the availability of ingredients and their own ingenuity. Egg-enriched doughs allowed for lighter, fluffier products, while sugar, now abundant and affordable, enabled glazes, fillings, and lightly sweetened pastries. Cream-filled buns, fruit-studded pastries, and early iterations of custard-based desserts appeared on bakery trays, marking the expansion of both skill and ambition. Lucy, a modern baker experimenting with a period-accurate batch, notes, "The first time I piped custard into a bun, I swear the whole room felt alive. Everyone was tasting, laughing, commenting. It's impossible to feel defeated when you're creating something this joyful. This diversification had immediate economic implications. Smaller, richer, and more aesthetically appealing products could command higher prices than basic loaves, generating incremental profit for both the bakery and its journeyman. Foreman could allocate portions of these premium products for market sales while reserving less desirable pieces for staff or local charity, creating subtle incentives and social cohesion within the bakehouse. Historical accounts describe a quiet but palpable sense of hierarchy renegotiation. Bakers who previously felt like cogs in a machine suddenly possessed skills that conferred value beyond sheer labor hours. Modern reenactors echo this sentiment. You can see people standing a little taller, speaking a little more confidently, James observes. It's amazing how a nice bun can elevate morale. The act of creating smaller, more intricate baked goods required an expanded technical repertoire. Bakers had to master enriched dough handling, precision proofing, even rudimentary decorating techniques. Unlike the simple 4-pound loaves that demanded mostly brute force and endurance, these products demanded finesse, timing, and an eye for detail. This shift had profound effects on professional pride. For the first time, many journeymen could demonstrate skill in a visible, appreciable manner. Modern bakers remark on the difference. Making a batch of buns that look and taste perfect gives you a rush you can't get from the standard loaf, Emma says. You're accountable to the dough, the oven, and your own standards. It's rewarding in a way I didn't expect. Moreover, product diversification altered the sensory landscape of the bakehouse. The aromas of enriched dough, cinnamon, sugar glaze, and fruit fillings transformed the air from the acrid, coal-tinged haze of earlier decades into a more inviting, almost celebratory atmosphere. Even in the subterranean settings typical of Victorian urban bakeries, the olfactory shift had a significant impact on worker experience. Modern bakers conducting full-night reconstructions remark on this perceptual change. The smell alone changes everything. You're suddenly awake, alert, and invested. You want the product to succeed, not just survive the night. The diversification trend also intersected with social mobility and consumer expectation. The burgeoning urban middle class, eager for variety and refinement, drove demand for products beyond basic sustenance. Bakers who embraced this shift found themselves catering to customers who judged quality, texture, and flavor rather than mere caloric content. Modern experiential bakers note that this mirrors contemporary craft baking pressures. We're thinking like Victorian bakers, and it's fascinating. People expect a bun that looks right, smells right, and tastes right. One misstep and you hear about it immediately. The interplay between social expectation and material capability created an ecosystem in which quality improvements fed back into worker pride and skill development. Beyond taste and appearance, product diversification also provided subtle yet significant psychological relief from the relentless physical grind of bakery work. While manual labor remained arduous, focusing on smaller batches with more sensory and creative engagement allowed moments of satisfaction to punctuate otherwise exhausting nights. Experiential bakers describe how these moments, perfectly proofed buns, an evenly browned crust, a custard-filled pastry that does not collapse, create micro-rewards that sustain motivation. Emma emphasizes, you're exhausted, sure, but you also get these little victories that keep you going. They remind you why you do this, why skill matters, why the work is worth it. Historical accounts suggest that such micro-rewards had long-term effects on retention and skill development. Journeymen who could master buns and sweet treats were more likely to remain in the trade, passing knowledge to apprentices and contributing to a more stable workforce. Foremen recognized the morale boost and leveraged it for productivity, allowing high-skilled tasks to be distributed more evenly and efficiently. The psychological lift of product variety, coupled with visible skill application, transformed the bakery from a place of drudgery into one of craftsmanship and, surprisingly, camaraderie. Modern bakers echo this observation. It's not just the dough, it's the teamwork, the pride, the shared laughs over a batch that behaved perfectly, or didn't, James remarks. Those nights feel alive. The creative possibilities were further amplified by cultural and seasonal influences. Victorian holidays and urban celebrations prompted bakers to experiment with shapes, fillings, and decorative glazes. Gingerbread figures, fruit-studded tarts, and lightly sugared buns became part of festive traditions, giving bakers a socially recognized role in city life. Modern bakers remark on the morale implications, making a little Christmas bun or a tiny tart for the street market. That's more than just work. That's participation in the culture. Pride is built into the process. Economic and psychological benefits were mutually reinforcing. As bakers developed skill, confidence, and pride through diversified products, the market responded with increased demand and willingness to pay a premium for specialty goods. This, in turn, allowed further investment in ingredient quality, tools, and minor innovations in technique. The positive feedback loop, better products, higher morale, increased skill, and improved economics, contrasted sharply with the grinding cycles of previous decades, where labor was relentless, ingredients poor, and rewards minimal. Modern bakers participating in reconstructions consistently note this contrast. You can feel the difference in energy and focus, Emma observes. When the dough responds, when your hands and mind sync, it's intoxicating. Product diversification also reshaped social dynamics within the bakery. Journeymen, once relegated to repetitive and demeaning tasks, gained areas of ownership over specific products. One baker might specialize in buns, another in sweet rolls, and another in custard-filled delights. This fostered a sense of personal accomplishment and a subtle hierarchy based on skill rather than brute force or endurance. Foremen could observe performance, offer targeted praise, and encourage mentorship. Modern bakers describe the dynamic vividly. People start to compete, not in a cutthroat way, but in a playful, skill-based way. Everyone wants their batch to shine. It's a healthy tension that drives excellence. In conclusion, the mid-1880s shift toward product diversification in London's bakehouses was transformative on multiple levels. The introduction of London buns, sweet treats, and more intricate pastries allowed bakers to reclaim pride in their labor, fostered morale and collaboration, and created new economic opportunities. As we draw the night's reflections to a close, it's worth letting the echoes of Victorian bakehouses linger a little longer in the mind, like the faint smell of caramelized sugar that refuses to dissipate from the cracks of a well-worn oven. There's a rhythm to remembering these spaces, a rhythm that mimics the labor itself. The methodical kneading of dough, the long arcs of flour dust floating in the dim light, the constant hum of ovens that never quite cool. In modern times, we might think of bakeries as cheerful spaces, filled with aromatic promises of breakfast, treats, and communal indulgence. But for the men and women who inhabited these underground chambers a century and a half ago, the reality was far more complex and far more raw. Reflection here isn't simply about nostalgia, it's about confrontation, a confrontation with the human capacity for endurance, moral compromise, and societal neglect. Consider the labor itself. The relentless physicality from the early hours of night to the dawn of morning shaped not just bodies but psyches. Modern bakers who attempt to recreate these practices are often struck by the intensity, by the way sweat collects and drips, not in gentle rivulets but in torrents that soak aprons and stain linen sleeves. Emma, while pressing her hands into a particularly recalcitrant batch of dough, muttered in disbelief, "This is chuffing heavy, pure brute force, I tell you." It's almost comical to the modern eye, yet beneath that humor lies the gravity of repeated microtraumas, strained backs, blistered hands, aching knees, that Victorian bakers endured nightly. And while today we can marvel at endurance, in their time, this was simply survival. The body, the mind, and the soul were entwined in cycles of necessity, exhaustion, and, at times, despair. And then there is the ethical dimension. The stories of adulteration, chalk, alum, and various other substances resurface with each reflection. At first, one might instinctively recoil, applying modern morality and declaring these actions unthinkable. Yet, to situate ourselves fully in the past, one must consider the pressures, the ever-tightening margins, the threat of competition, the financial instability of being a journeyman with no guarantee of daily work. It's here that philosophy meets the flour-dusted floor. Could a man, sweating through 18 hours of labor, refuse to stretch his ingredients to survive? Would the moral clarity we prize now have been possible when survival itself was uncertain? Modern bakers, while tasting a deliberately adulterated loaf in a controlled experiment, often voice astonishment. "It smells almost like mortar," one says. Another grimaces, "And yet I can see why they did it." The pressure, it's relentless. Reflection here is uncomfortable because it exposes the limits of ethical absolutes under the weight of material necessity. Beyond the ethical and physical dimensions, the social structure of the bakehouse warrants meditation. The hierarchy, foreman, second hand, third hand, fourth hand, was more than a system of management. It was a lens through which laborers experienced life itself. Power, autonomy, and access to resources were distributed unevenly, often brutally so. Fourth hands, who endured the most punishing tasks for a fraction of the foreman's wage, were not just physically subordinate, they were socially and psychologically constrained. Modern bakers observing these structures in period reconstructions often remark on the insidiousness of the social design. It's like every ounce of your energy is taxed not just by the dough but by the system itself, Emma notes. This dual oppression, both bodily and institutional, creates a layered understanding of suffering that purely quantitative descriptions cannot capture. Yet reflection does not stop at suffering. Amid the grime, the coal smoke, and the towering sacks of flour, moments of ingenuity, pride, and subtle resistance appear. The emergence of product diversification, the creation of buns, London buns, and sweet treats, was more than an economic strategy. It was an assertion of skill and creativity within rigid confines. It allowed bakers to reclaim a sense of agency, to witness the immediate fruits of their labor, and to experience a rare pleasure in an otherwise punishing profession. For modern observers, there's an unmistakable lesson here. Even in conditions of scarcity and constraint, human ingenuity seeks outlets, and morale can be cultivated through small but meaningful acts of craftsmanship. The sensory experience of reflection is also crucial. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of warm bread, the faintly sweet aroma of sugar glazed over buns, the earthy scent of rye and wheat mingling with the faint tang of yeast. Now overlay that with the acrid sting of coal smoke, the dense cloud of flour dust that coats the air in your lungs, the sticky sweat that clings to the nape of your neck. Modern bakers conducting night-long reconstructions report that these sensory juxtapositions are startling. It's almost intoxicating and yet suffocating, Emma says. You feel alive in a strange, exhausting way. Reflection in this context is not abstract. It is embodied. One cannot separate the lessons of the bakehouse from the physicality, the smells, the tactile resistance of dough, or the ache that lingers long after hands are washed and aprons hung. And there is mortality, ever present, quietly threading its way through every layer of labor. Average life expectancy for a Victorian baker hovered around 42 years, a statistic that is both stark and haunting. It forces reflection on the cost of labor, on the uncounted human hours spent in subterranean ovens, on the psychological toll of constant vigilance against fire, collapse, or health failure. Modern experiential bakers sometimes joke darkly, calling a weary journeyman a dead man walking after a long night, but beneath the humor lies an acknowledgement of the precariousness of life in such an environment. Reflection, then, is inseparable from mortality. Understanding the historical reality means contemplating the fragility of existence amidst industrial and social pressures. The Victorian bakehouse also illuminates the relationship between labor, diet, and society. Bread, the staple of working-class existence, was both sustenance and symbol. Its production, adulteration, and consumption reveal how the needs of labor intersected with economic imperatives and moral compromise. Reflection here requires us to consider our modern assumptions. The privilege of choice, the luxury of ethical clarity, and the freedom to value skill and quality without the constant specter of survival pressures. Modern bakers, while tasting a historically accurate loaf, frequently remark on the humbling nature of the comparison. We complain about an 8-hour shift. They were doing double that with their lives on the line. And yet, reflection is not only somber. There is joy, fascination, and even humor embedded in the archival stories and modern recreations. The peculiarities of working with coal-fired ovens, the creative problem-solving required to manage yeast and sugar in less than ideal conditions, and the moments of camaraderie among journeymen provide contrast to the relentless hardships. Modern bakers frequently laugh at the absurdity of it all, even as they appreciate the ingenuity required. James observes, "You realize how creative people had to be, not just in baking but in surviving and finding pride in a system designed to grind them down." Philosophically, the Victorian bakehouse challenges us to confront questions about labor, ethics, and human resilience. How much suffering is too much? Where does moral responsibility begin and end when survival is at stake? How do social structures amplify or mitigate individual agency? These questions resonate today, albeit in different contexts, reminding us that labor in all its forms is never merely physical. It is ethical, social, and psychological. Reflection becomes an exercise not in judgment but in understanding, empathy, and a recognition of the layered complexity of human experience. Even in the late hours, when modern reconstructions conclude and lights are dimmed, the bakehouse leaves lingering impressions. Fingers still dusted with flour, hands aching, lungs recalling faint echoes of coal and yeast, bakers carry forward insights not just about technique, but about endurance, community, and the paradoxical beauty embedded in harsh conditions. Reflection in this sense is both temporal and spatial. It spans the distance from past to present, from underground chambers to contemporary kitchens, reminding observers that work, creativity, and moral compromise are intimately intertwined. Ultimately, the lessons of the Victorian bakehouse extend beyond flour, coal, and oven heat. They speak to human adaptability, the intersection of labor and morality, and the importance of small, meaningful victories in sustaining pride and community. Modern bakers, scholars, and even casual observers can draw insights from these reflections. That even under oppressive conditions, skill, ingenuity, and a measure of dignity persist. That ethical compromises, while troubling, are understandable within the context of survival. And that joy, creativity, and human connection are not luxuries, but essential components of labor itself. As the last crumbs fall from the tray, as the ovens cool and the night winds down, one can almost hear the echoes of Victorian bakers whispering through history. A reminder of endurance, of moral complexity, and of the enduring human. As the night deepens and the echoes of clanging ovens, flour-dusted hands, and the relentless rhythm of Victorian bakehouses fade from memory, let us pause to draw the final threads of reflection across our journey. Imagine the warm amber glow of a lantern, casting long, soft shadows over a quiet kitchen. The air is still, yet faint traces of smoke and yeast linger, a subtle reminder of labor, endurance, and history. These traces are more than sensory artifacts. They are echoes of human effort, morality, creativity, and survival interwoven across time, now softly settling into the stillness of our present consciousness. We began this journey in the crowded, dimly lit cellars of 19th century London, where the lives of bakers unfolded in a dance of necessity, skill, and resilience. These were men and women whose work was both physically punishing and socially constrained, whose sweat and effort powered communities and industries, yet whose individual needs were often disregarded. As we retraced their footsteps, kneading the same heavy dough, feeling the strain in our own muscles, we glimpsed a world where survival demanded endurance beyond what modern safety standards would tolerate, and where moral choices were entwined with the very act of sustaining life. Through each section, the story unfolded in layers like the dough itself, dense, complex, and rich with texture. The hierarchy within the bakehouse, rigid and unyielding, revealed the social structures that govern not only work but opportunity and autonomy. Foremen wielded authority, journeymen navigated instability, and fourth hands bore the brunt of labor, experiencing both physical hardship and psychological subjugation. Reflecting on these dynamics, we gain insight not only into the historical past but also into the enduring human relationship with work. How systems shape behavior, how inequality weighs on both body and mind, and how communities navigate, resist, and adapt within constraint. The nocturnal rhythms of the bakehouse reminded us of the intimate connection between time and labor. Long night shifts, stretching across 18 hours or more, became a crucible in which resilience was tested and identities were forged. For the bakers of Victorian London, night was not a reprieve but a canvas of toil, punctuated by sweat, soot, and the persistent aroma of yeast. Modern experimental bakers, in recreating these conditions, could feel the pull of exhaustion, the sharp awareness of physical limits, and the strange exhilaration that accompanies mastery of a demanding craft. Here we learned that labor is never just about exertion. It is about rhythm, endurance, and the silent conversation between body and task. The physical demands were intertwined with sensory awareness in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. The weight of 20-stone sacks of flour, the resistance of dough, the grit of coal dust and flour particles in the air, and the oppressive heat of ovens, these were realities that shaped every motion and decision. Experiencing these sensations allows us to empathize with the endurance of those who came before us, to recognize that human perseverance is often as much about adaptation to environment as it is about raw strength. The humor and grimness intertwined in their experiences, dead men walking, torrents of sweat, arms trembling yet pressing onward, remind us that resilience is never purely noble or clean. It is messy, embodied, and profoundly human. Alongside the physical, the moral dimension of the bakehouse emerged with striking clarity. The practices of adulteration, chalk, alum, and other substances, initially provoke our modern judgment. But as we reflect, we begin to see the complexity of survival, the entanglement of ethical choice and material necessity. These were not acts of wanton deception but strategies born of systemic pressures. The high cost of flour, intense market competition, and the precariousness of freelance employment. In tasting, smelling, and observing these historical realities, we find empathy where condemnation may have initially arisen, and we recognize the broader lesson. Morality is not abstract. It is lived, tested, and often negotiated within the constraints of circumstance. Equally revealing was the interplay between labor and sustenance. Bread, the staple of working-class life, functioned as both literal and symbolic fuel. Its weight, cost, and caloric density were intimately connected to the demands placed upon those who baked and consumed it. In our reflections, we observe how labor shapes diet shapes energy, and energy shapes society, a cycle that underscores the profound interconnectedness of human systems. It reminds us that every loaf of bread carries within it the stories of those who made it, of communities nourished, and of the delicate balance between survival and ethics. The rise of middle-class consumption, the advent of fancy breads, and the diversification of products illuminate the evolving relationship between craft, culture, and economic opportunity. Sweet buns, cream-filled pastries, and intricately glazed loaves were not mere indulgences. They were expressions of skill, pride, and the negotiation of social identity. For modern observers, tasting these recreated treats provides a tangible link to human ingenuity and aspiration, showing how even in a context of hardship, creativity and pride persist. Reflection here reminds us that work is never merely utilitarian. It carries meaning, pleasure, and the possibility for personal and social fulfillment. We also, now, as the night deepens and your own body begins to relax, it is time to carry these lessons into a gentle, meditative state. Imagine the warmth of the bakehouse, not in its harshness, but in its sensory richness. The soft amber glow of lanterns, the subtle scent of freshly baked bread lingering in the cool night air, the rhythmic, almost musical sounds of dough being kneaded, of trays being slid into ovens, of quiet murmurs exchanged between bakers sharing the burden. Let these images wash over you like a lullaby, each sensory detail softening into calm awareness.